Testing 1, 2.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a nice breakfast. Alex is getting ready. We are going to be live streaming this on the web, so I apologize for being a little bit late. Food came first and fellowship and all that other good stuff. For those of you who may not have been here yesterday, I'm Judy Biedenharn, Chairman of the Board. And this is Cindy Romer, who is this year's conference chair. Without her, none of this would have been possible, so we owe Cindy a great big thanks. Woo-hoo, thank you. And that leads right in. It's not me doing something, and it's not Cindy, but it's the whole board. So I'd like to just kind of proceed right now with introducing our board of directors. A couple of people could not be here, and we'll recognize them afterwards. But I am the chair. Cindy is a board member and the conference chair. Carol Langer is our treasurer. Don Kraus is our vice chair and does an awful lot with their website and all that other good stuff. Carol manages our money. Larry Kellerman in the back. Larry was our very first caregiver representative. His wife, Colleen, unfortunately passed away earlier this year, but he has agreed to come on as a full-fledged board member, dropping the caregiver role. So we're glad to welcome Larry in that role too. Okay, that's all of the board members we have present, but we have a couple of board members, Pam Bauer from Canada, who was unable to be here. She's our secretary and does an awful lot with the Facebooking and the social media web pages, and is our secretary. So we miss her dearly, but she had a family commitment. And Philip Fortier from Michigan, his mom is ill, and so he's playing a caregiver role right now. We can all appreciate that. She does not have MSA. His brother.
Educational portion of our mission. Also, we have to extend our sincere thanks to the Ochsner team. They were here yesterday, many presenters. We have more presenters today. Yep. With special thanks to Dr. David Houghton, who was at the helm. And these docs they're doing more than just presenting. They've connected us with resources. Dr. Houghton, hands-on, was lugging boxes around yesterday. Dr. Lee was staffing our table this morning. So they're a great team, and we're very happy that they were our hosts this year. So we're excited to have them and their presentations coming up. Which leads me to the exhibits. We will have the same tables out today that we had out yesterday, so you can get information about some of the resources available, and the Ochsner team is one of those resources. Allison is here, and she's staffing the table. That's a social worker that was at one of these sessions yesterday. We have a number of the MSA charities represented. We've got the Brain Support Network, ARP, VesiFlow, Durameds. You can take some look at the equipment available to you and information about that. So there's some good information out there. There's some additional literature near the MSA Coalition table, so do get as much information as you can while you are here. A request actually from one of my constituents back in New Jersey came up, and I'm going to incorporate that right now before I go on to identifying the MSA charities. Making connections here is an important part of what we do. just a sense of, so you can look around the room, how many people are here from the Northeast? New Jersey, Connecticut, New England. Raise your hands if you're from the Northeast. How about the Mid-Atlantic states, Delaware, Maryland? Okay. And so, look around, that you can make those connections. Midwest. Where's our Midwest contingency? Yep. Southwest. I know we have a big group from Texas, right? Yep. Okay. How about the Northwest? I know I sat with some people from Oregon this morning. Great. Okay. And then the West, California. There she is, Robin's people. Southeast, yes. Well, listen, we're in the Southeast. This is our home group. Let's save them for last. Okay. All right. Good idea. So, the other group that I want to mention are the MSA charities. You're here today with the MSA Coalition, and it is our sincere hope and goal that we can continue to work with others that are out there trying to support those of you that are traveling this MSA journey. Last night, you were able to, those of you that were here last night, were able to meet a few of the MSA warriors, as we like to call them. There are individuals that are out there that are doing work. Bob Summers, want to stand up, Bob? Out there individually, meeting with people, supporting them, lost his wife Susan. Mona Law, joining him in that, Mona, right? And we have, and I remember, Mona, when you lost Paul, it was actually March 1st, our awareness month. I remember that distinctly. Susan's hat and Paul's hat are out there on display outside, so do take a moment and take a look. I want to mention Larry Kellerman again. You've already met him. He's in the back. In addition to being a member of our board, he's been doing work with caregiving. He's got the website, the Facebook page. He's been working out in Illinois with support groups. Some of the organizations, you met Richa last night in Belgium, and there are others worldwide. Where's Richa? You want to stand up for a moment? We've got the Griswold Foundation, and Tracy and Rex are here, and I saw them. Tracy, you want to stand up? Oh no. Okay. Well, you'll connect with them, and we'll try to point them out for you later. They have a foundation to raise funds for research. We've got my original group, MSA New Jersey. Kim, where's Kim? Did I lose her? There you are. We're based in New Jersey, and we've actually grown to more of the tri-state area, and we're growing. We're more hands-on with support groups and little smaller conferences like this. Those that couldn't be here with us today, Lily Shee's got the foundation and Cure MSA out in the San Francisco area. And then you heard Joe Fortier, who is a member of our board, also has Defeat MSA in memory of his brother, Joseph Fortier, who we lost to MSA, and that's in Michigan, in the Detroit area. And Phil has also taken over with the MSA Shoe. Is there anybody here that doesn't know about the MSA Shoe? Yeah, I didn't think so. He's done a great job. It's an awareness tool. The MSA Shoe travels the world spreading awareness, the history being a prank among friends that then brought joy and laughter to an MSA patient that then became a Facebook page, creating awareness, and now is really a world traveler MSA icon. Okay, so, the important thing for you to know is that now more than ever, efforts are being made on your behalf. Awareness, support, education, research. So, as you leave here today, you're going to have a lot of sessions, the ones you attended yesterday, some of them a little bit hard to hear, some of them very practical and very useful. But most of all, we hope that you walk away with a renewed spirit, uplifted at the connections that you've made here today, the information and the support that's available to you, the people that are there working for you. Leave with hope, new acquaintances, and know that you are not traveling this journey alone. So we welcome you here today, and I am going to turn the mic back over to Judy.
Okay. Thanks, Cindy. That gave a really, really good idea of why we're here and who we need to thank. One other thing, there are some index cards on your tables. The doctors will be entertaining questions, so as questions pop into your heads during the various talks, write them down. One of the board members will come around to collect those, and then they will answer those during the Q&A session. For those of the people watching from home on YouTube, there is a way you can also submit your questions. So we ask that you do that if you have questions. It's very difficult sometimes for physicians to interrupt their talks to take individual questions. So by writing them down, we can lump them together if they're similar topics, that sort of thing. So if you run out of index cards, let us know, we can get more, okay? And that being said, I do have a welcome letter in the notebook, as does Dr. David Houghton. But there's also an insert in the notebooks about our research projects. I refer to it in the letter. So if you did not get a chance to read that yesterday, please do so. If not now, when you get back home. On the table, there are some little wristbands, and there's some New Orleans style necklaces from the Ochsner Medical Center. So if you have any other questions, I believe there's also wallet cards on the tables, and they're just an identification that a patient can carry to if you haven't looked at those, take one and look at it. Just more or less says, I'm not drunk, I may walk, I may stagger, I may, not talk plainly, but I've got this disease called MSA. So it's a very quick, succinct little way to make people unaware if you need to very quickly show some identification so that you don't get put into a little box of someone that's had a little too much orange juice for breakfast in the morning. Okay, so and if you need a couple of those, take a couple. You might want to have one in the wallet. You might want to keep one if you have a packet of info going that you have ready to take to an ER, that sort of thing. Keep a couple of those around. Okay, I think that's probably all the housekeeping things from now. So I'd like to introduce the host physician, Dr. David Houghton, and he's just got a fantastic program for us today, and I'm going to let him explain all of his achievements and whatever he wants you to know about him. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. That'll keep it short and sweet for sure. So thanks again to Judy, and thanks to Cindy, and thanks to all of you. This is the only type of event like this that happens yearly, and it's really a remarkable achievement, not only for the MSA Coalition, but to have so many wonderful patients and family members and care partners that are able to make this trip, both live and across the web. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia originally, did my training at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and stayed on there to do a movement disorders fellowship, and took a unique interest at that time in not only the more typical movement disorders that many of us treat in my area of interest, but particularly the atypical ones, such as MSA. My first job after finishing my fellowship was at the University of Louisville, where I had the unique opportunity to work with Irene Litvan. Dr. Litvan is an atypical Parkinson's specialist in her own right. She's authored multiple papers both on PSP, MSA, and Lewy body dementia, and others. She actually had the largest funded study ever to study the genetics and environmental influences of a disease called progressive supranuclear palsy. So it was my 5 years there where I was able to continue my education, as we're all lifelong learners in medicine, and really grow to appreciate the trials and tribulations of multiple system atrophy. I had the opportunity to come down here to Ochsner in New Orleans just about 5 years ago, as we were growing an important Ochsner Neuroscience Institute. And we were making every effort with patients just like all of you in the room and families at your side to grow our clinical care, our education, and our research in all the neurosciences, but again, particularly in movement disorders, and for me, the atypical ones. It was when I got here that I had a great opportunity to meet Hal. We're going to hear about Hal this morning. Hal had MSA type P. He was here in my clinic about every 3 to 4 months for several years. He'd come in with many of his family members, many of whom are here today sitting in the audience. And it was through that experience with Hal that I had another opportunity, and that was to meet Dr. Allison Mailloux. Dr. Allison Mailloux from the Bayou. So Allison grew up in Louisiana, a lifelong Louisianan from Baton Rouge, did her training at LSU, and then went on to the Marshfield Clinic up in Wisconsin to finish her internal medicine training in Stade. She's been up there for more than 20 years now. But she's always kept her Louisiana roots, and when her brother Hal got sick, those roots only got deeper. And she was at every single visit that he had with me over the course of several years. Hal died not that long ago, and we're going to hear about his journey and what he went through with the family. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Allison Mailloux.
Well, thank you, Dr. Houghton, and thank you to the MSA Coalition for allowing me to speak today. And I come to tell you about my brother Hal Ballinger, his story with MSA, his journey from a perspective as a sister and a caregiver, but also as a physician. When I was asked by Dr. Houghton to give this talk today, I was overcome with emotion, and I talked to my family and kind of wondered if we should do this, and everybody was like, well, by all means, Hal would want you to do this. He wanted his story told. But because you could ask Hal any day of the week, he always hoped that his experience would somehow make it better for those who followed him with MSA. As David said, Dr. Houghton said, I'm an internist at the Marshfield Clinic in Marshfield, Wisconsin, which is in the dead center of the state, home of lots of dairy farms, cheeseheads, and of course, Packer fans. And even though I live 1,200 miles away, our family's really close-knit. And Hal grew up as the only son among 3 sisters, and that's not something that was fun for him, I'm sure, as he was growing up, but one he surely treasured, particularly at the end. Hal and I shared a lot. We both loved the outdoors, and we both liked to fish. I taught him how to play football. And we both loved Star Trek, although his fascination with that series was much deeper than mine, and he would go to Star Trek conventions. Trekkie to the heart, he brought me a T-shirt with all the doctors from the franchise on the shirt and signed by Eugene Roddenberry. We both bled purple and gold in our love for the LSU Tigers, and Hal would travel just about anywhere to see his Tigers play. He loved a good cigar, he was a cinema buff, and he loved to volunteer for the local film industry here in Louisiana. But and he was also 5th generation for our family business, which was Kornmeyer Furniture Company in Baton Rouge, which had opened in 1880. But his greatest treasure were his sons, Elijah and Noah. About 2007, Kornmeyer's closed, and Hal lost the only job he had ever known at age 43. His marriage dissolved, and he began having what we thought were panic attacks. He drove off the road in one event. He collapsed walking out of the Galatoire's restaurant in Baton Rouge and crashing a table. He had an orthostatic event wherein he was walking across the Coca-Cola plant or interviewing for a job, and he said, all of a sudden, I found myself face up looking at my hosts on the floor. We all thought he was dealing with a great deal of anxiety, and his local physician, Dr. Bill Moore, treated him as such. But then later in 2009 and 2010, I kept getting these phone calls. He says, Allison, I keep wetting the bed. Or I have a tremor in my left hand. I can't button my collar button. My friends tell me I don't swing my arms when I walk. So I told him to see about getting a neurology consult, and Dr. Moore sent him to the neurologist who diagnosed him with probable Parkinson's disease, and he had Hal placed on carbidopa and levodopa. And initially Hal responded, but this response would wear off. So the doctor would increase the dose, and the response would wear off. And eventually he tried pramipexole and ropinirole with the same type of initial response, but then the response would wear off. About that time, I was studying for my internal medicine board exams, which we have to retake every 10 years, and I was using a system wherein you had modules from the various medicine subspecialties, and I just so happened to be studying the neurology module. And I was given a case presentation and had to come up with a diagnosis, and this patient had worsening gait unsteadiness, increasing falls, erectile dysfunction, increasing constipation, orthostatic hypotension, normal muscle strength with muscle rigidity, slow gait with reduced stride length and arm swing, but normal mental status. And of course, the answer was multiple system atrophy. And I'm thinking, gosh, that sounds so much like Hal, but I mean, it couldn't be. This is a rare disease. And I barely remember in my medical school classes a neurology lecture where there was a list of Parkinsonian-type diseases, and I'm pretty sure Shai Drager was down in the middle of the pack somewhere, as that was known 30 years ago when I was in medical school. But the more I studied this, the more I became convinced that I think, Hal, you got MSA. And I called him and I told him just that, but I didn't tell him anything else because I knew he was going to Google it. And sure enough, 15 or 20 minutes later, he called me and he was so angry at me. He says, thank you for being the bearer of such great news. And I said, well, Hal, just bring it up to your neurologist. And so he did. And Dr. Murphy said, well, I'm not ready to label you with MSA yet. I want to try some more medication trials. And in the meantime, I said, well, I'm going to investigate this disease. And at the time, the largest MSA clinic in the country, based on what I could find out, was at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And I knew that Baylor had a nice clinic and that Mayo Clinic had a large clinic, but Hal and Dad elected to go to Nashville and they met Dr. Clausens. And Dr. Clausens didn't want to label him with MSA at first either. He wanted to try some more medication changes and trials. But eventually, in July of 2013, he labeled Hal with MSA. And he told my dad and Hal, he says, look, I'm happy to see you here in Nashville, but as this disease progresses, your disability is going to make it difficult for you to go back and forth from Baton Rouge to Nashville. I've got a really great colleague, Dr. David Houghton, who is forming a neurology department at Ochsner in movement disorders, and I think you need to see him. And we did hook up with Dr. Houghton, and Dr. Houghton's caring and cheerful attitude, we treasured that with every visit, and Hal would look so forward to those visits because he was always come away with some hope. I also learned at that time about the Multiple System Atrophy Coalition and realized that their 2013 annual meeting just happened to be in Milwaukee, 3 hours from my home. And so I went as a sister and a caregiver, but also as a physician because I needed to learn more about this disease and resources with which to serve my brother. And I was warmly greeted. I'll never forget this. I walk into the convention hall and Vera James warmly greets me. And I met Judy and Don and Pam and all of these great people, and I noted their enthusiasm and their passion for MSA. Let me tell you, this group of people is your very best friend. If you don't know them now, get to know them. And we had a caregiver breakout session, which was led by Carol Langer. And at the end of that session, I said, you know, I need to go home. And I arranged a family meeting with Hal and the rest of my family. And I elected to show the DVD, Sophie's Search for a Cure, which details a patient named Sophie and her journey with MSA. And I can tell you that at the end of that presentation, there wasn't a dry eye in the room as we realized that this is probably what Hal faced going forward. Hal continued to have frequent falls and his speech began to slur, and he lost his job as logistics manager for Domino's Pizza Warehouse in Baton Rouge. He did not qualify for long-term disability, but he qualified for SSI, but no Medicare, no Medicaid. He called me 2 weeks before Christmas of 2013, and he had lost his car and the ability to drive. He had lost his house and had to move in with my parents, and he had lost his dog and his cat. I mean, his world was crashing, and he was sobbing on the phone. He says, Allison, why would God allow me to suffer so much? And I could have, you know, we're a family of faith. I could have told him God has a plan. There's something good that's going to come out of this, but that wasn't going to console Hal. And I would lay and wake in bed at night myself saying, God, where the heck are you? And I started to think about Hal and what I could do to help Hal and what our family could do for Hal, and I discerned there were three things we could do. We could choose to help walk with Hal and help him carry this burden with compassion, and the Latin root for compassion is to suffer with. Or secondly, I could kind of interact with my family but just ignore Hal's condition and let any anxiety or turmoil create something toxic within me that would harm me physically and emotionally and harm those around me. Or I could just walk away from Hal and my family altogether and just forget the whole business. But only the first option was tenable. And we were all going to need a lot of special grace to help Hal and to walk with him, to suffer with him. I took Hal to his congressman's office, and Hal was teetering on his walker. And we get to the congressman's office because I wanted to find out how could we get Hal immediate Medicare benefits. Now, understand that you're only eligible for Medicare, of course, when you turn 65, but the only other conditions are patients with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease and those patients with end-stage renal disease requiring dialysis. Now, the Congressman's office told us, have his doctors write ALS and MSA are similar. Well, the Social Security Administration didn't like that word similar, and Hal was turned down. When you compare the two diseases, however, ALS and MSA, you find that they have a very similar incidence. They're both found in 3 to 4 out of 100,000 people. They both have a similar prognosis. Most statistics say on average, the patients in each disease die within 6 to 10 years of the onset of symptoms. They both incur total disability due to a defect in the nervous system, although it's a different part of the nervous system for each disease. One difference is that no major U.S. athlete or celebrity has had MSA until the recent death of Las Vegas rock and roll chef Carrie Simon, who did an enormous amount of work to promote awareness of MSA, and he passed away in September of 2015. There was a Russian gymnast, Nikolai Andrianov, in the 1970s who also had MSA. Now, because Hal lacked Medicare eligibility, he could also not get any help from the local Council on Aging and Disability. They told my dad, we can't even talk to you until Hal becomes Medicare eligible. The Affordable Care Act may not be very popular with a lot of people, but it sure helped Hal with obtaining insurance and getting coverage while he had MSA. In the meantime, our family looked to try to get some support, so we found a support group for MSA here in New Orleans, and they meet on one Thursday night of the month. But that's an hour and 10 minutes away at night, and that was not going to be an easy thing for my 80-year-old dad and my brother to attend. So they tried going to a few Parkinson's disease groups in Baton Rouge, but Hal's needs were very different. They even went to an ALS support group in Baton Rouge, and again, the ALS patients were eligible for so many more resources than Hal was eligible for. We contacted John Pastorek from WBRZ TV, and he did a wonderful Sunday Journal 30-minute news piece interviewing my parents, Hal, and his local physician, Dr. Bill Moore, explaining MSA and promoting MSA awareness. And at the end of that piece, we offered contact information for anybody in the greater Baton Rouge area to contact our family to start a support group, and we did not get very many responses. I contacted the major medical and neurology clinics in Baton Rouge, hoping that we could, with some kind of cooperative effort, pool MSA patients together and start our own greater Baton Rouge support group, and I was not successful there either. But in the meantime, our family found the monthly caregiver webinars hosted by Carol Langer to be very valuable, and my sister Melinda, who lived in Naples, Florida at the time, attended that support group. We also tried to spread awareness and had over 200 Hal's Angels MSA awareness bracelets made while Hal was ill, and distributed 200 more at his funeral. I tried to contact the Baton Rouge newspaper and was during the month of MSA Awareness Month to see if we could get a story on MSA to spread awareness, and we were turned down in that venture as well. So I contacted the editor of the Catholic Commentator, which is the newspaper of the Diocese of Baton Rouge, and Mr. Richard Meeks did a beautiful piece on MSA and Hal, and that information reached individuals in 12 civil parishes or counties. My sister Ann Scott teaches at Baton Rouge Lutheran School, and every year they do a fundraiser for a particular cause, and in 2014 they chose the MSA Coalition as the recipient of over $1,500 for research. Hal and his boys were also participating, as well as my dad, with their dad on the scooter. Hal led the LSU marching band in their traditional march from the music building to the stadium one pregame Saturday, and he proudly rode his scooter with his MSA awareness poster in the front, accompanied by our cousin Andrew Wilson. I organized a grand rounds at the Marshville Clinic and invited Dr. Brad Heiner of the Medical College of Wisconsin, and he gave a nice lecture on MSA to a packed crowd at the Marshville Clinic. Hal would have disease plateaus, and we'd think, oh great, we're coming up for air, this is beautiful. But then Hal would have setbacks, and there were two major causes of his setbacks. MSA patients lose the ability to regulate their internal body temperatures, and keeping Hal hydrated and cooled in the Louisiana heat was quite a chore. He would have a setback if he got too hot. MSA patients also struggle with urinary tract infections, and Hal was no different. MSA patients have difficulty completely emptying their bladder and will often have to resort to either intermittent catheterization, which Hal did for a while, or permanent catheterization, which was what Hal was dealing with at the end. In any case, all three scenarios will promote bacterial growth in the urinary tract, but Hal would bounce back when we treated those urinary tract infections with antibiotics. Hal's speech became unintelligible, and whereas in the early part of the disease we were able to use Hal's help pivoting with the gait belt, we eventually had to use a Hoyer lift to get him transferred. He would have frequent falls, and we called the local EMTs to help get his 6'4", 300-pound frame off the floor. The strain on my parents was visible. We suggested nursing home placement, but my parents and Hal wouldn't hear of it. We told my dad, you got to get some help. And not until his cardiologist told him, Mr. Harold, this is going to kill you. You've got to get help, did my dad say, okay. But the problem was, where were we going to get the money to have sitters? I mean, even nursing home without Medicare coverage, and well, Medicare doesn't even cover nursing home, but we had no way to pay for any of that. We set up a Lots of Helping Hands website, and I believe Carol has that on her piece, the website for that. And my sister Ann Scott basically organized that, setting up a calendar for providing meals and taking Hal to the movies, which he truly loved, or to the LSU football games where he had handicapped seating. We also had a calendar for where friends and family could volunteer to sit with Hal while my parents went on an errand or just wanted to get away. In the meantime, we found out from Hal's insurance agent, who's married to a cousin of ours, that he was eligible for an accelerated death benefit. Now, according to the accelerated death benefit, Hal could withdraw 1/3 of his life insurance policy value and put that into a special account for medical expenses, durable medical equipment, supplies, sitters, or anything else he needed, including a handicapped van. All he needed was a letter from his doctors indicating that Hal had a terminal illness. Utilizing that money, we were able to start hiring some people to come into the home, and we found out an individual that had cared for friends of family in the home, Mr. Rivers Livas. And Rivers joined our Hal's Angels team and would take care of Hal during the weekdays, taking care of any needs that he had, helping get lunch, taking him to the movies, taking him to appointments. He also would come get him on Saturday afternoons in the handicapped van to take him to Mass. We also realized we needed other help, and we contacted an agency called Home Instead. And Paula Speed came several mornings a week to help with his hygiene and getting him breakfast. And then we also realized we needed help getting Hal supper and getting him tucked into bed. And so we found out our house painter of 20 years, of all people, sat with folks in their homes. So Thomas Rhodes would come most evenings during the week, and he was always just a cell phone call away at any time. Hal eventually qualified for hospice, and a hospice nurse would come in once a week to organize his meds and assess his need for any durable medical equipment. And a hospice aide would come 3 mornings a week, again for showering and breakfast and checking his blood pressure and so forth. Hal's alma mater, Catholic High School, which is right down the road from my folks' home, heard about Hal's disease, and they set up a lunch account for Hal, wherein Hal and Dad could review the lunch menu, and if they saw something they liked, they would send Rivers down to pick up the lunches from the high school and charge it to Hal's lunch account, which was funded by donations from family and friends, particularly alumni from my dad's class and my brother's class at Catholic High. Hal's bathroom needed to be made handicap accessible, and so we had a family of cousins who donated the money for that project, which was led by a classmate of my dad's who was a retired contractor. Hal also had attended the Jesuit Retreat House, Manresa, which is halfway between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, for 30 years. And as his disability grew, it became more and more difficult for him to attend retreat. But his retreat group, which we affectionately call the Men of Manresa, made extraordinary efforts to make sure Hal never missed a retreat until he died. Special mention has to be made of the Sacred Heart Bunch. I'll never forget my first MSA conference in 2013, and I was struck by the idea that friends and family would likely walk away and disappear because they wouldn't understand the disease, they wouldn't understand the disability, they wouldn't know what to do. I'd like to help, but And as I thought about this going home, I thought, gosh, if this group of young men, Hal's best friends from grade school days at Sacred Heart School in Baton Rouge, left him, Hal would be devastated. And it would distress our family as well. So I called my dad and I told him my concerns. And he called Joel, who's the spokesman of the group, and explained that to Joel. And Joel's like, Mr. Harold, how could you think we would abandon Hal and your family at this time? These young men were available 24/7, and they were able to take Hal and include him into all kinds of events, their class reunions, graduation parties for their children, and they even took vacation days to take Hal to our family camp north of Baton Rouge. There was also a Sacred Heart Bunch women's division that provided meals once a month for Hal and his boys when the boys would come spend the weekend at the house. And to this day, those women keep in touch with Hal's boys. Hal realized the need for spiritual support to help him die, and so he contacted Father Jeff Bahi. Father Bahi was a friend of the family, and Hal had served his first Mass after Father Bahi's ordination. Father Bahi met with him once a month and also met with his young sons, Noah and Eli, to help them prepare for their dad's death. He also met with Sister Maria Rabelais of the Congregation of St. Joseph once a month, and Sister Maria had taught my sister Melinda and I in the first grade. Finally, the summer of 2015, he received Medicare benefits, but we also saw a parade of urinary tract infections. At the end of August, Dr. Moore, Hal's doctor, who had mentored me in medical school and in my internship at Earl K. Long in Baton Rouge, called me at the clinic in Marshfield, and he said, Allison, Hal's got a urinary tract infection, and it's not sensitive to any antibiotics. This is terminal. And I said, well, I'm planning on coming to see him at the end of October and take him to see Dr. Houghton for that. He says, Allison, he could get septic and go at any time. You know that. And I did know that. And I dropped the phone. I canceled my next week's appointments, and I flew to Baton Rouge right away. The upcoming game, the following weekend, LSU was set to open with McNeese State, and Hal had decided that he wasn't going to go to the first few home games because of the heat. Hal was going to miss his first home football game in 40 years. And my family and I, we wanted to do something special for Hal, so we contacted former LSU basketball coach Dale Brown, who had followed Hal and kept in contact with him during his journey with MSA. And Coach Brown made arrangements for Hal to meet Coach Les Miles. Hal exchanged an Hal's Angels MSA awareness bracelet with him, and Coach Miles wore that to the press conference, which we saw on the 10 o'clock news. Hal got to watch a practice, and Hal was also featured on the 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock sports report, again, raising awareness for MSA. Hal also wanted to take his boys to the D-Day Museum here in New Orleans, and if you haven't seen the D-Day Museum, it is so well done. It's worth your time. So Hal's ex-wife and Kathy and I loaded Hal and the boys into the handicapped van and did a whirlwind afternoon tour of the World War II Museum, D-Day Museum. Eventually, the next day, Dr. Moore came to the house, and he and I sat Hal and the family down and explained the terminal nature of Hal's urinary tract infection. Hal immediately wanted to see the Sacred Heart Bunch, and there were 2 of them there within minutes. At that time, Dr. Moore pulled me aside, and he said, Allison, it's time to quit being Hal's doctor. It's time for you to be his sister. Because I'd been coming home every 3 months and taking him to see Dr. Houghton and try to ask questions and answer the right questions and do whatever I could to help relieve the burden on my sisters and family that were here 24/7 with Hal. And I cherished his wisdom, and actually his wisdom gave me a sense of peace at that time. I realized at that time also that I had to hurry up and honor one of his last wishes, which he had expressed to Dr. Houghton, that he wanted to donate his brain for MSA research. So I had to try to arrange for his brain donation and brain harvest, and I contacted the Brain Bank in Jacksonville, Florida, who gave me the name of a contact to do the brain harvest, but this individual had retired. So I contacted the pathology departments of the major hospitals in Baton Rouge, the 2 medical schools here in New Orleans, a forensics unit in Lafayette, the East Baton Rouge Parish and the Jefferson Parish coroner's offices, and were turned down with regard to Hal's brain harvest. And I truly believe, Dr. Houghton and I were shocked, but we truly believe that the reason we were turned down is because of the publication about a month prior of what is known as the Prion paper, which was a study done at UCLA and printed in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which indicated that perhaps MSA was caused by a tiny protein called a prion and acted in an infectious manner similar to a virus or a bacteria. I contacted, it was about that time that I finally met Robin Riddle. I met her personally this weekend, but I met her on the internet, and nobody worked harder than Robin to help me get Hal's brain harvest done. She finally got me into contact with the University of Miami, which made every arrangement free of charge. All I needed to do was fill out a little paperwork and fax it back to Miami, and when Hal died, they had left us some instructions, and when Hal died, they came and performed the procedure, and we got the results within 9 months that was definitively diagnosed Hal with MSA-P. I have a medical degree. I've seen autopsies, I've seen brain harvest, and I had this much trouble trying to honor my brother's last wish, and I can't imagine what anybody without my background goes through in trying to secure a brain harvest. The anguish that it caused me affected my mood, my relationships, and even my medical practice. It caused me so much angst. And because of this experience, I would like to offer that brain donation must be made easier and must be facilitated by the agencies that want these brains for research. Hal got to go to a few more home football games as the season cooled, and his best friend from preschool, Joey DeLon, took him to the LSU Florida game in October. It was a fierce battle between two SEC undefeated powerhouses with lead changes back and forth, ending with some Les Miles Mad Hatter magic with a fake field goal, and LSU won the game. So I called Hal on Sunday to see how he had enjoyed the game, and he was still sleeping after noon. His lethargy progressed, his fatigue progressed, his twitches progressed, and his appetite declined. And as I mentioned, my sister Melinda had moved from Naples, Florida to Baton Rouge to help with his care, and she would ask him, Hal, what do you need? And he would just point to his DNR bracelet, indicating, just make me comfortable, no heroics. And Melinda was very heroic in calling in the hospice team to help make Hal comfortable at the end. As Hal lay dying, he had his young son Elijah laying on his left shoulder, and his other son Noah on the opposite side of the bed, and he was surrounded by their mother Kathy, my parents, my sisters, Sister Maria Rabelais, and Hal's godmother and her husband Sid, who was a man of Manresa. They were praying the rosary when Hal breathed his last. Sid emailed me later, and he said, Allison, that was the most beautiful death I've ever witnessed, and it's changed my life. And he let the other men of Manresa know that, and those men, about 25 of them, came and led the rosary at Hal's wake. This story's long, but I hope it gives you a bit of hope. But it involved a lot of angels, and we all found out that each one of us had gifts that we didn't even know about. Melinda coming in and attending to Hal's care. My sister Ann Scott with her attention to details and setting up the Helping Hands calendar and arranging meals and arranging for Hal's finances and paying his bills. My parents and overseeing the whole picture in allowing Hal to stay in their home throughout his disease. And my medical knowledge and hopefully being able to answer and ask the right questions. We also appreciated Hal's ex-wife Kathy and her support because she let the boys come in to stay with Hal every weekend, lifting his spirits and allowing them to provide many hours of loving service to their dad. Winston Churchill said, when the going gets tough, when you're going through hell, keep going. And my gosh, there were a lot of times when we went through absolute hell. Father Bahi has a favorite quote by the monk Abbe Everlay that says, out of our pain, out of our shame, our God creates virtues that never would have existed had we not first suffered. And I kind of think about, when I thought about Hal's illness and everything that came after it, I think about how a farmer burns the fields after, like they do in the Louisiana sugarcane industry. They burn the fields and the fields are dead black. And now all of a sudden you'll see little green shoots come up. And then all of a sudden the sugarcane fruit is produced. And I think we all saw that there were a lot of fruits that were produced from Hal's journey with MSA. Hal grew spiritually, and Father Bahi told me, he said, Hal's journey of spiritual growth allowed him to see a suffering Christ out of which came hope. Hal used his suffering to make this time with his sons richer and allowed an ordinary man who became sick to die a holy man with faith and acceptance. Hal didn't choose this disease, but he allowed himself to accept it and laid down his life for others so that others would have a better experience with MSA. We saw some fruits in Hal's young sons. Elijah told me after his dad died that he stood up to a bully that was badgering another teammate on the basketball team. His oldest son, Noah, had to write an eighth grade paper for a project on an example of a good Christian, and Noah wrote, "I chose my dad to write as an example of a good Christian. He taught us to care for others and to respect authority and to be honest and kind. When we got no help from Medicare or any agencies, we experienced the love and support of so many family and friends and new friends who shared their compassion with Hal, their suffering with him. And because of this suffering with and knowing we had done everything we could for Hal, I truly believe that our grief was tempered. Hopefully through Hal's experience, MSA will be recognized by local and federal agencies regardless of age as ALS is recognized, and hopefully immediate Medicare benefits can be enjoyed by MSA patients. Hopefully the formation of MSA support groups by cooperative effort among local neurologists, particularly in large metro areas like Baton Rouge, will become a reality. Hopefully the facilitation of brain harvesting and donation will be made easier so that the search for a cause and a cure for MSA will be found. And hopefully Hal's experience and yours will increase the awareness of MSA among the local medical and lay communities. Again, at Hal's funerals, we donated 200 more of the MSA Hal's Angels bracelets, and we distributed also water bottles with the MSA logo and website encouraging donations for MSA research. Each of these bracelets had the Jesuit signature AMDG, which stands for Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, Latin for to the greater glory of God. And that's how Hal and our family experienced this. That's how we thought about Hal's journey with MSA. I want to close with a quote from Coach Vince Lombardi. Hal loved Coach Lombardi, and he actually knew Vince Jr. This quote was actually printed on Hal's funeral card. But I firmly believe that at any man's finest hour, his greatest fulfillment of all that he holds dear is the moment when he has worked his heart out in a good cause and lies exhausted on the field of battle, victorious. Thank you.
Allison, thank you very much. What an emotional journey that you've allowed us to take a glimpse of, and one that I know really rings true for all of us in the room. I love that hopefully slide. Those 5 hopes of Hal and you and your family and all of us, that's really our call to action with MSA. So we're going to remember those 5 things that we all hopefully will happen as a result of the experiences of you and with so many people who suffer with this illness. I'm truly honored at this point to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jay Rao. Dr. Jay was born and raised in India, came to the U.S. in 1971, continued with his training at the National Institutes of Health and further at the side of Dr. Stan Fahn at Columbia in New York. He's been a preeminent expert in movement disorders and neurology with a particular interest in the Parkinsonian and atypical Parkinsonian disorders for over 40 years, and he's been in this community both at LSU and at Ochsner during that same time period. He's now an esteemed full professor and endowed chair back at LSU, and I always mention back at LSU because the whole reason I'm here is because Jay promised that he was going to retire. And he and I knew each other from support groups and from study groups, and the fraternity and sorority of movement disorder specialists is pretty small. So when an opportunity came that Ochsner was growing and I had the chance to join my wonderful colleague Georgia Lee in the Department of Neurology, I knew I was coming to the right place because Jay had helped train Georgia and Georgia had endorsed Jay, and I knew that everything was going to turn out fine as Jay retired. But then Jay didn't retire. Jay just left Ochsner, and then he wandered a couple miles back down to the French Quarter, and then he took a left, and he ended up back at LSU again. But we are certainly fortunate to have one of the true experts in movement disorders and MSA with us here tonight, and I am personally grateful that he remains a friend and confidant and a colleague here in town, Mr. Jay Rao, Dr. Jay Rao. For you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hopefully. Yeah. Say the next slide. Is that what it is? Just need to close out that one. Now you have,
Let's call
right here. Yes. Oh,
you want to close it?
I'll get it. This one.
Yes. MSA too.
And there is
All right. Forward it. Okay, got it.
right there. Advanced thing.
David, thanks. Thanks for asking me to participate. And Cindy, I apologize for giving so many heart attacks during the last week. Without deadlines, we can't function. But this deadline was dead so many times. And most importantly, I want to thank you for coming here. Hopefully, you're able to forget all your problems and have a good time in New Orleans. And I want you to come back again here. Well, let me begin with this conversation that David and I had about a year ago. He calls me, "Hey Jay, I'm going to have this MSA meeting in October next year. I want you to be in it." I said, "Sure, no problem." So 1 month went by, 3 months went by, 6, 9, I got panicky. So I called David and say, "David, is the meeting still on? Am I on?" Sure. So what topic do I talk on? Give me a second. So it looks through on. I looked at all the speakers. You're the whole fart in that group. So I want you to talk about the historical aspect of the disease. So with great pride coming from an East Asian culture, I carry my old man identity with great pride, and I'm here. Thank you for putting me in my place. What I'm going to tell you is story. In fact, I'm going to tell you many little stories. And at the end of it, hopefully you'll recognize where we were 50 years ago, where we are today, and where we have to go to conquer this disease. Okay? So, advance. So in the clinic, these are all some of the common questions we get from patients. What's my diagnosis, doc? I don't know. Still don't know yet. I come to your clinic for the last 6 months. Do you really know what I have? No, I'm not sure. You could be one of these things. We put a man on the moon in 20 years, that is, you still can't diagnose me? I've been coming to your clinic for 2 years. No. They told me you are the expert, but you don't have a diagnosis yet? And the worst of all is, what kind of expert? This is the sons and daughters of the family members. He's a young Turk coming on. He's totally upset. What kind of expert are you? Send me to somebody else. I want a second opinion. So you eat your humble pie, hide underneath the desk for 2 days, and then get up and say, what can I do? So this is the problem that we have from our end. And I'm going to list you other things that we have to face. In this process, I'm going to mention other different diseases: multiple system atrophy, PSP, CBGD, and there may be other disease waiting in the line that may be included. Literal translation of what MSA means. That means multiple functioning systems of the brain. You have atrophy. Okay, these are all descriptive terminology, not a real reflection of what's going on in the disease. Spinocerebellar ataxia complex, progranulin mutation disorders. I wouldn't be surprised if these are added sometime in the future. So you know more about this disease than some of us do. The description Dr. Mayo gave was so wonderful, what the life, not only the patient, the people around them go through. So this is a set of diseases which are insidious onset. You don't know when it got started. You don't know how it got started. The early signs and symptoms, you ignore it. Of course, my colleagues will talk about this in greater detail later. Mild to moderate rate progression. In the first half of the disease, doesn't progress that fast, so you're still able to do many things that you did before. Manifest many of the signs and symptoms. So the common theme is many of these diseases have Parkinsonian features. They may also have one or many features of other diseases I mentioned overlapping that makes the clinical picture all the more confusing to us. And the most important thing of all is they're mostly unresponsive to levodopa. Okay, let's take multiple system atrophy. Where were we 50 years ago? Dr. Milton Chai from NIH, Dr. Glenn Drager from Houston described clinical, they had 4 patients and brains from 2 of those patients. They did great analysis of those brains and described in great detail the clinical spectrum. And 2 of the patients, they have greater description. They are the autonomic type of multiple system atrophy. And they didn't know what to name it, so they just called it the way it is, a neurological syndrome associated with orthostatic hypotension. So the major issue here was drop in blood pressure. So this disease was later known to be Shy-Drager syndrome. Nobody uses that term, but that was what was Shy-Drager syndrome. Well, I don't want to go through this, but these patients had autonomic dysfunction first, Parkinsonian features later, and they had a little gait problem and coordination of the hand problem. They even had, or at least one patient had ALS-like phenomena. So you can see the disease involved the basal ganglia, Parkinsonian part, cerebellar, the gait part, and the anterior horn cell, the motor neuron part. Multiple system atrophy. So what do we know about this? After having seen so many patients, we now are able to clearly recognize 3 different types of patients with MSA. MSAP, that is vitaminal type, that is Parkinson type. That means you have most features of Parkinson's disease and few aspects of the cerebellar and the autonomic type. And the second one is MSAC, cerebellar type, where you have gait problem or nose or hand-mouth in coordination. And the most important one, which is very difficult to treat, is the autonomic part, where you drop your blood pressure precipitously. Okay. While we are focusing on this in the 60s, I was in my early years of medical school, vaguely heard all of this. Of course, there was no name for us to attach the syndrome with the name. Then some other disease popped up, brand new progressive brain disorder called progressive supranuclear palsy. That's a fascinating name, so we remember that more than MSA, and we were looking for this. By then, I was a resident in neurology in India, 1968, so we were able to diagnose many patients in India. Of course, we couldn't do anything here. Forget about anything we can do in India. So all we did was diagnose, sent them home. And this is, the big picture is of Dr. Richardson. And the next picture on the right top is Dr. Olszewski. He's a phenomenal scientist, died too early. He wrote books about human brains, extraordinary pathologist. But Dr. Richardson saw several patients in his Toronto hospital and collected so many patients, but he didn't know what to do with them. So he collected the patient's history and all of that and some brains, and the hospital hired a new neuropathologist, Dr. Olszewski. Then he goes to him right away on the very first day I was at work. He goes to him, look, I got these brains, I want you to look at it, there's some peculiar disease. Let's look into it. And the photograph at the bottommost, small photograph, is the patient, where the patient is looking straight, primary gaze, and he is unable to move his eyes. Okay? So this was called a Steele-Richardson, and they had a fellow next year, Steele, S-T-E-E-L-E. He's still very active in this PSP research. And they published a paper in 1963 and 64 about PSP. Same thing. Slow, insidious onset, 55 to 70 years, common onset, postural instability, rigidity, where Parkinson's disease, patients are stooped over. These patients have lordosis, they walk like lords. Okay, a supranuclear palsy, couldn't see clearly because of double vision, they couldn't move their eyes, and ultimately they developed dementia. This was the picture in 1964. What do we know? One key thing is, if a patient comes to my clinic and says, I'm dizzy all the time, very clear statement. I'm dizzy all the time. It's not Parkinson's. It's one of those atypical Parkinson, probably PSP, probably MSA. Very clear. So now we have so many subtypes of this PSP. I'm a splitter. There are lumpers and splitters. I think we need to split everything. We need to split the atom to understand how the universe was born. Same way, we need to split all these groups of diseases to figure out what is the common theme among them and understand, go into the details of the disease. And came another disease, corticobasal ganglionic disorder. And this was reported in 1967. And the next report was 20 years later. Nobody made diagnosis. Nobody recognized this as a unique neurological problem. So this report was made in 1968. And slowly, the presentation of this is so dramatic. Nowadays, it's hard to miss the diagnosis. We're getting good at diagnosing, but we don't know what to do. We'll come back to that next. Well, okay. So what do we know about CBGD now? We now know that CBGD presents mostly with cognitive dysfunctions first that we have ignored all these years, but more on the motor symptoms, Parkinsonian features come later. If you wait till the Parkinsonian features, you already missed the diagnosis by about 2 or 3 years. So let's see where we were with the treatment of MSA. All we had in 1960 and 64, a good academic neurologist who will hold your hands, look straight in your eye, listen to all your complaints, listen to your questions, and try to give you an honest and open answer to those questions, saying, I don't know what you have. You didn't like to hear that from us, but that's a fact sometimes. In the early days, we did not have any diagnostic tools either. We didn't have CT, we didn't have MRI, nothing. It's all how many patients you've seen before, how good you are, how much attention you pay to the patient. Can you link all those signs and symptoms together? That's all. That's all we had. And the best thing we could do was give L-DOPA. L-DOPA was introduced late 50s and early 60s. So not many people, not many physicians were aware of L-DOPA. Even if they were aware, they were not thinking about giving it to you. So, but those patients who got this did not get any better, so they gave up quickly. Some patients did respond for a year or two or 1.5 years. That confused me more. You got Parkinsonian features, I gave you medicine, you must have Parkinson. Except that after 1.5 years or 2 years, gradually declining response, you keep on increasing the dose, and after that, nothing works. You get more side effects from the medicines than the benefit. That was in the 1960s. Now we have a methodical answering, a questioning system we can come up with a diagnosis, or at least a tentative diagnosis. Don't pay attention to the details of that. But the point I'm trying to make here is we have a mental algorithm so we can easily separate these diseases reasonably well. Not all the time, but most of the time. And we now have MRIs and CT scans. One thing we look for PSP is Mickey Mouse brain. That's a perfect Mickey Mouse. I'm getting a little old, And we also have what we call as hummingbird sign. Okay? See the hummingbird there, and you can see that hummingbird down at the pons and the midbrain and the medulla area. So with the most important thing is the clinical expression. And we put that clinical expression with these brain scans and try to come up with a better, more accurate diagnosis. Still we are wrong many times. And this is PSP. The top one is CBGD. Look at that posterior part, the back portion of the brain, completely atrophied. Whereas in PSP, the atrophy is not that bad, and it's slightly a different picture. The more you look at it, the better you get, and you still make mistakes. So where were we with the pathology 50 years ago? When the different subtypes of MSA were reported between 60s and 80s, we didn't know anything about pathogenesis. We were only in the descriptive stage. All the papers said, the brain is shrinking, the cells are shrinking, there is junk piled up. We didn't know anything. We stained with all kinds of stain. Some are blue, some are dark brown. All of these are piled up inside the cell. I don't know what it is, but there's something wrong. That's all we could say. Now we know better. With the advent of DNA technology, molecular biological technologies, we now know in many of these diseases, 3 different proteins, at least 3, they accumulate in the brain. One is called alpha-synuclein, another is called tau, T-A-U, and another one, the last sentence there, beta-amyloid. And now we are recognizing many diseases where this protein called granulin and progranulin mutations, that is a new set of disease coming into the front. But the peculiar thing is, these proteins accumulate at different parts of the brain. The one, that blue, the pink, round, beautiful circle surrounded by brown spot is an intranuclear inclusion of a protein called alpha-synuclein. The second gray shaded photograph has got the entire cell. The cell has a mutated protein, abnormal protein accumulation, not within the nucleus, but outside the nucleus, but within the cell. The third one, the dark patch you see at 4 o'clock, is the beta amyloid accumulation. And one at 11 o'clock, the brain cell with an arrow showing, that is accumulating tau, and this is accumulating beta amyloid. But this is outside the cell, and that is within the cell. The last picture, the blue color one, the synuclein is accumulating not in the neuron, but in the so-called support cells or glial cells. They are not support cells. They play a major, important role. These glial cells express proteins that are responsible for growth and survival of neurons. And that is what is seen in MSA. Okay? So we have these proteins accumulating in different parts of the cell, different parts of the brain, but they're in an overlapping fashion so that you really can figure out in the beginning, clinically or pathologically, what is happening. So it was a black box. We didn't know what happened. So we needed to peel off gradually, slowly. We don't know what kind of ghosts coming out through that lab. So we now have a molecular classification, a group of brain disorders in which beta amyloid is accumulating predominantly. I said the key word is predominantly, and that's the Alzheimer's-like disorders. We have another group of disorders where alpha-synuclein accumulates. That is Parkinson's-like disease. And this is the mad cow disease, prion protein, where the prion protein accumulates. And for you, this is what is called as tauopathy. That means the protein tau accumulates predominantly in these diseases like CVGD and PSP. But at the end of it, everybody gets a little bit of everything. Okay? So when you look at the brain, you need to see what is the predominant protein accumulated, and then you get a pathological diagnosis. When Dr. Mayo got a pathological report, it's a report of an ultimate process that has happened, and that is the only way we can be dogmatic about the diagnosis. I hate to use the word dogmatic. You can't be dogmatic about too many things in life, but close to it. So where are we now? That is in the last 20 years. Where are we now? We're thinking about going to Mars. Okay? Where are we now? Why is that these proteins, why are they accumulating? Are we making too much? It's true in some diseases. Why do they accumulate in different part of the brain cells? You have no idea. What happened in the normal garbage removal system? You know, when patients have stroke or little stroke, the brain cells die and break into pieces, and the garbage removal guys come and haul it away. What happened to it? Why didn't they clear off all these protein? And more importantly, what happens if you keep on accumulating? If you allow these proteins to accumulate, they're going to choke the cells and kill the cells. That's very clear, physically and metabolically. Okay? These proteins become gooey, like a chewing gum in a movie theater. You can't get rid of them no matter whatever you do. You have to put in a washer. Okay? So they attach them so, and it's like a black hole. Once they're formed, everything gets sucked into that gooey stuff. Good stuff and bad stuff. Chemicals that are responsible for cell survival get stuck to it, so the cell dies. So we need to prevent the accumulation. We need to stop it. If they're making too much, we need to stop it. If you're accumulating for other reasons, your garbage removal system doesn't work, we need to kick it into function. So what happens if you keep on accumulating? This is a picture of Alzheimer's disease. The leftmost three pictures. Alzheimer's disease starts in a small area. And that is what I call as intern stage. You go to the intern, you take your dad to the intern and say, this is not my dad. He seems to be forgetting a lot. Nothing. He's 75. He's going to forget. Go home. And then about 1 or 2 years later, he's a total mess because he can't figure out do anything. So you take him to a neurologist. Neurologist takes 5 minutes to diagnose it, but we can't do anything. And then the third is the nursing home or psychiatric institution stage, where gradually that accumulated protein has spread all over. This is our new challenge. While you're focusing on protein accumulation, this concept, this biological phenomena popped up in the last 5 years, 7 years. And this is very critical for how we treat you in the future. Why? Because we need to stop the accumulation right there. Why is that? And this is the PSP. You can see gradual progression at the bottom end. It starts way up there. The second figure on the top. And the sixth figure, the lowest one on bottom right, is the ultimate pathology, before death or after death. So gradually it is spreading. Actually, these proteins crawl out of those neurons and creep up to other parts of the brain. That's a new thing that we are encountering. That's good news and bad news. The good news is, if we can stop that from going one part to another, we can arrest your disease. But this is brand new information, so we need to consolidate this concept, prove this concept in other diseases, and then come and try to think about coming up with medication that will stop this transsynaptic, transregional transport of these bad proteins. This shows how it spreads from one place to another. And not only one place, they're all interconnected. You know, if I'm connected to somebody, I pass it on that bad information to that person. If I'm connected to another person at the same time. So it spreads simultaneously to 3 or 4 different areas of the brain. Ultimately, the brain is full of chemical junk. Multiple system atrophy treatment, honestly, I hate to tell you that, but we really do not have any drugs that is targeted to either slow or stop the disease, not just yours, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and all of that. If you can only slow the progression of the disease by 5%, the longevity of productive life will expand. You don't have to find a cure, unless you want to live forever, which is highly impossible. But if you slow down by 5%, you'll have more productive life for a long time. So, despite prominent Parkinson-like features, most drugs that are used for increasing dopaminergic transmission don't work. If you have severe hypotension, you can use a brand new drug that's in the market, Northera. If you have any question, ask David. He knows more about it. Okay? And there is a booth out there. So this is where I finish. Hopefully, you now will excuse us if we didn't make a diagnosis right away, or come up with the treatment right away. because we are facing impossible, very difficult to resolve challenges, and this takes time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate you all. Thank you very much, Dr. Rao. Hit on a lot of parts, going all the way from the history of the disease to the pathological context to future directions for care. Really excited to have the opportunity to continue with our program this morning and this afternoon, where we're going to talk about early treatment of disease, we're going to talk about later treatment of disease, and then this afternoon we get into the novel compounds, where we're going with new biologics, where we're going with research. With that, I'll pass it off here to Judy. She'll go over a couple of housekeeping issues, and I look forward to seeing all of you in just a few more minutes.
Why is it I always get stuck with the housekeeping stuff and they give all this good information? Hand me the broom. No. Because we got started a little late, we are kind of have progressed through our break time. So take a quick break. Then we're going to come back. We're going to have 2 breakout sessions. One in Salon B, which is where we are now, is going to be intended for those diagnosed within the last couple of years. Okay, so if you're newly diagnosed, you're going to want to return back to this particular room. Simultaneous in Salon C, they're going to be talking about the global MSA registry. And then when that's over, it's going to flip. And then in here is going to be living with advanced MSA. And then the MSA registry program is going to be repeated. So everybody's going to have a chance to go to the session about the global MSA registry. And that's really, really important. So take as short a break as you need, then come back and we're going to get started. And if you have questions, fill those out. We'll be walking around getting those index cards from the tables during the break. Thank you.
All right, so I'll move them on here. Cheryl, are you our electronics guru?
Well, I'm not sure how much we can do. What do you need?
So let's load up my talk here now. Supposedly Dr. Avi Samra, who's joining us, has taken it and modified it on a stick.
Okay.
He has stepped out.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and
So-
get ours up at
So
least.
you can,
So this is going to be the early treatment one that I sent with no changes to Judy about to Cindy about a week ago.
all right, so let's just see here. I don't have it. So we need to get it.
All right, so we need to get it from
Cindy.
Freddie. Okay.
Sure. I'm doing tech support at the moment, but no, that's okay. Go ahead. No, that's all right. So there's one of the things that's important in doing clinical trials and things like that is to have a database of patients. And so the MSA Global Registry is exactly that. It's a database of patients, and patients enter their own information. Their doctor helps to verify the information. And then as new treatments or possible new treatments come out, those patients are, we know who they are, and so we can contact them about global.
But in this case, we have to pass
So not all the records. I would suggest go to one of the sessions and listen. I mean, tell Lucy. Lucy Kaufman is Lucy Norfolk Kaufman is the person who's heading up this whole thing, and ask her the question and tell her you live outside of the U.S. How do you do this? Because I know that the MSA Coalition is funding this. It's a really important project. And it is global. There's a big contingent in Europe. They're talking about South America. So I'm sure that Mexico would be included, but I don't know the details of how it works. But go to the session and ask. Yeah, but no. It's all confidential. It's highly. That's one of the. It took a long time to get it set up because it is all subject to all the confidentiality rules of all the countries.
Okay, so whenever they have something new, they quote.
And she can answer that question. But yes, they know how to contact the people who could participate in the clinical trial. So it's important. Okay? It's detailed, but it's important. It's a lot of records, but very confidential. You don't have to worry about that. Right. Yeah.
Nice to see you. If all else fails.
Well, except that we need to make sure that
What sort of pluggy you got?
one of these looks like that. Like that.
It's like that one.
That one should do it. Let's try that one.
Where's your harmonica? Excellent. I like your stuff. Did you find it? There's the thought. Sure. Oh, you know, the old saying, fake it till you make it.
Sounds like my love. Anyway,
Yeah. As long as no one else says it. Yeah.
what the Cleveland Clinic that surprised me one time
Yeah.
bicycle thing ran.
You're looking at me like, what are you doing?
You know, I'll try to do two things at once. Reasonably successful.
Do that on the railroad. There's a locomotive.
Yes, I remember you said that. One at a time is always better.
Hi-ho.
Yes.
When trains wreck, it's really a big
I know. Makes the
You
news.
didn't do that.
It makes the news. Everyone really get upset.
Yeah.
A few accidents, but no, I was very much.
Well, yeah, I'm sure.
This is our lighting guy.
This is our
Are you
man.
the lighting guy?
He's our AV guy.
We actually need a lighting guy because, with this thing being bright and with us in the dark, I wonder if it's the pictures
Well,
look
we
weird,
have,
so I
we
wonder
have
if
to
it's
ask
trans.
Alex that question.
Well, he doesn't control the lights in here.
No, but he knows how it looks through what he's doing.
Got it. Yes, sir. Carry on.
I'm switching computers. I think we're good. Okay. But probably just hang out for another minute.
Don't go
if you don't
far,
mind.
just in case.
But
Do we have Wi-Fi in here if we needed to connect?
no.
All right.
Technology.
Do we have an Ethernet cable in here?
Your cameraman is using it?
Okay. All right. That's fine.
All right, carry on. I promise I could do two things at once, but now
You don't need Skype. You can close that.
no, I'm good. Well, I can assure you I'm not going anywhere. They won't let me. Thank you. They were wearing me out about not wearing my purple tie yesterday. I said, listen, I got one purple tie. Sometimes you just have one purple tie. We good?
And then,
No.
When-
No,
when-
Dr. Abdi Simon's going to get bent out of shape because it doesn't have his slides attached. But
but if he has a flash drive, we can just stick it in there. And then you hit.
is it advancing? Is it
So I
behaving?
think we should turn this on.
Okay.
I turned it off to save the battery. Now, we're good.
Look at you. Don't sweat the small stuff.
I bought this on Amazon 2 days before the conference.
And it works.
Well, Cindy's.
buy two?
No, I didn't. But Cindy's like, "Do we have a clicker?" I'm like, "No, but we will." A slide clicker. So it's now turned off because
Okay.
I don't want to.
Save that one battery that you got.
Yeah, bingo. So if you need to.
This has a splitter, so if he wants to plug something in, we might be
Also
able to be
bingo.
smart enough
Yes.
to do that.
And you may have to open if he plugs it in there, you have to hit my computer and go to the flash drive, and I'll be right here.
If you have trouble, just ask your teenager.
Exactly. We saw a couple of them.
Well, I'm pretty good at this stuff, and this.
You'll recognize Dr. Abisam. He'll come in like a whirling dervish wanting to put his slides in.
All right, all good.
Thank
Anyway,
you, Carol.
now you can.
All right. Lay it on, sir.
I think we're good.
Right. Yep. They got a fellow in this Unless you think, well, let's see if we can open it on there and read only.
So what happened to this other one? Why won't we put it on this one?
For some reason, they don't have my presentation on it.
You can download it. You can download it now
To here?
to this one.
From here?
Yeah, I have it. I have
But
yours.
won't it be encrypted? This is a crappy.
No.
You've got all of it on there.
Yeah, I told you.
Lay it on me there, Doc. Let's make it.
So
I'm not gonna-
I have yours.
Until we get proof. Until I prove it's here, I'm not going to
You
ditch
told me
this
you
one.
didn't change anything.
I changed nothing.
Okay, good.
Let's go find it. All right, Carol's got it.
Where's-
Let's find Carol.
هي مشي الحال حطيت عملة سلايسز زيادة. ثانك يو. كيف واحد عنده ابل ومشي الحال. I love you. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I can get you all set up here. You're good.
Can you unlock us?
Here we go.
And I think David needs to see that
Carol's the woman with the plan.
Okay, so
This is better than usual. We have a backup and a primary, and things may work out.
Yeah, this is the one. There are 3 of them. Do this one and this one.
Yeah, open them both. That's a good idea. And we're going to do beginning
Put
first.
them on here.
do you want me to?
Just you can transfer it on yours or whatever. But we can open it up. Let's see what it looks like. You want to take a look and see if
Okay, so what you need to do.
this one we don't want to use. It's encrypted.
We just want to unplug from here to here.
Okay, that's easy.
Yeah, this one is a real problem.
In an organized fashion.
That's not a problem.
We know that this works. Just pull.
Yep, pull. Straight out. Don't bend it. Don't bend
No
it.
bending. Nope. That was you. You just went right through.
This one is, does cyber warfare.
Exactly right, yeah.
Optimal.
Take a look.
But we aren't worried about cyber terrorism. We're mostly just worried about LSU and Tulane.
Just do a slideshow so that David sees that. Okay, this is what you sent me that I added
Okay.
in.
So then
So then I'll do diagnostic
we have-
criteria.
we-
I'm going to pass off to you, and then you're going to pass off once it gets there.
Here.
All right, so we have this
So this is
fancy.
my stuff.
We have this fancy clicker.
Okay.
$28 on Amazon. I just want you to know I
That's
made a
pretty
huge
good.
investment here.
That looks great.
All right.
Nice.
So I, made it look a little
Yeah.
nicer too.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Okay, I did
All
the
right,
other
so-
one
so
too.
Where's
this-
your- and you
See
put the
this?
other one.
The other
Oh,
one's
drives.
still there too.
So when you're on your last slide, just pass it back to me, Freddie,
that's
and I'll
exactly
say MSA's attorney.
So you want to put them on your desktop, or do you want to keep it in here?
just leave it here.
Let's-
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We got them both in here.
I'm inclined.
I'm going to take a quick bio break myself.
Yeah,
and
I
I'll be
think
right
that's
back.
always a good thing.
Can we come and walk?
Should we try to set this up here? Are you okay holding it? This is a test. Can y'all hear me on the microphone, or is that too low? Too low? It's okay? We're trying to figure out if we need to hold the mic or if we can set it. Of course, it's sort of angled here. Better? Better there? Okay. This will be the option. I'm wondering if I'll be the one to knock it over, if it'll be my colleague, Dr. Lee, or Dr. Abisamra. I think we're just waiting for Dr. Abisamra to come in. Travel to the middle parts of Texas and go to Houston or Dallas, or even on into Alabama, Birmingham, or the Gulf Coast of Florida. So we're very proud at what we can do here in the Gulf South for all of you. The opportunity today will be for me to talk at the beginning part of our MSA journey. There'll be a fair amount of crossover between this talk and the advanced journey in the beginning. So for those of you who are here for this talk, I would encourage you to take the time after this to check out the MSA registry next door, and those folks will plan on coming in here for the advanced journey. Alternatively, you're welcome to stay for both. The differences predominantly will be with some end-of-life decision-making that goes on with advanced care, as well as a deeper dive into some of the medication treatments that we do. So I'll start off, and then I'll give it to my colleague, Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee and I work together in the Department of Neurology. She's also a movement disorder specialist and received subspecialty training and fellowship of that with Dr. Rao here in New Orleans. And then finally, we'll pass it off to my friend, Dr. Freddie Abisamra. He's an electrophysiologist, cardiologist, and he'll talk a fair amount in detail about the real dangers and risks and complications of orthostasis and the other complicating cardiac problems that occur with MSA, because for the vast majority of our patients, that tends to be the one that sort of rises to the top. So what is multiple system atrophy? You know, in many cases, what we're doing here is preaching to the choir. We recognize that this is a progressive disorder that affects multiple systems with that underlying autonomic dysfunction. And so what's the autonomic nervous system? Well, that's really our automatic nervous system. It's the stuff that handles our activities of daily life from the inside out that you don't think about. Because in fact, when we think about these independent systems, you don't think much about your heart rate. You don't think about your blood pressure. You don't think about digesting a big belly full of food or what happens afterwards in the creation of stool. You don't think about our urinary processes and sexual dysfunction. In fact, you know, all of us have had times when we wished we could think about it and it would work, or times where you wish it wasn't working quite so much in a social situation. So we realize that there's so much of our systems that is under autonomic and automatic control. In the normal human body, each of these are run out of the brain. So the brain is really our main computer. It's our main CPU that allows us to control these systems. The cardiovascular system, for instance, it gets a lot of its action from a part of the brainstem called the nucleus ambiguus. And what it does, it helps drive blood pressure and helps drive heart rate. And there's parts of the peripheral system where it recognizes how low our blood pressure gets, and we try to have a compensatory reaction to raise it. With the gastrointestinal system, we realize that it affects part of the brainstem and the spinal cord called the vagus. So the vagal nerve system starts up in the brainstem, continues down into the spinal cord, and it's going to be in charge of making our tummy rumble and churning up food and helping us create our stool. The urinary system similarly runs out of that vagal system, so everything is closely related there. But we haven't even talked yet about our otolaryngological, I'm just going to call it ENT. It's the ENT, ear, nose, and throat, right? So what happens there is when we take a deep breath, we realize that our vocal cords need to be in sync with what's happening with our pulmonary system, because our pulmonary system is under automatic control as well. So you can appreciate through everything outside of the nervous system, or apparently outside of the nervous system, it's under nervous system control. But of course, that which binds us to multiple system atrophy is either those Parkinsonian features of slowness, stiffness, shuffliness, and shakiness, or those ataxic symptoms, those ones arising from the cerebellum with effective voice and eye movements and balance in limb control. All of that runs under the control of the autonomic nervous system, and what this slide shows here is that it breaks into two major parts: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system arose during evolution as part of our fight or flight response, realizing that if you were going to see a saber-toothed tiger walk by your cave, you were either going to fight it or you were going to run in order for your DNA to make it to the next generation. So the sympathetic nervous system makes our pupils get big. It makes our mouth dry. It actually locks up our bladder because no one has time to stop and pee if they're running away from a saber-toothed tiger. The counter to that is the parasympathetic nervous system, sometimes called the rest or digest part of our nervous system. And that's essentially the opposite of what happens with the sympathetic drive. So your pupils get smaller, and you might create saliva to be able to eat that meal, and you're going to sit and you're going to churn up the food and relax, because in fact you don't need to worry about what's happening in that fight or flight response. And so we live in a balance. The autonomic nervous system decides when to turn things up, and it decides when to turn things down, and that's what's going to be affected in multiple system atrophy. So what happens when these multiple systems misbehave? Well, if the cardiovascular system misbehaves and we stand up quickly and about a liter of blood ends up pooling in the veins of our feet, if the autonomic nervous system is misbehaving, we're not going to push that blood back up to the brain as well. And the blood pressure goes from 140/90 to 70/40, and we pass out. Or what happens if the GI system doesn't behave? Well, it means that when we eat a meal, it's not going to make its way through us. So we're going to get full earlier, and we're going to have more constipation, and we may have more pain associated with it. What happens when the autonomic nervous system misbehaves with the urologic system? Well, that's where there's going to be difficulty with deciding whether to start our urinary stream or stop our urinary stream. And with regards to sexual dysfunction in men, we can see early erectile dysfunction in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, even leading up to a diagnosis when the autonomic nervous system misbehaves. When the ear, nose, and throat system is awry, we develop stridor, and the vocal cords get tight, and they are not well aligned with our breathing apparatus. And our breathing can become more shallow. We may have more difficulty oxygenating our blood. And our sweating system gets affected. So our skin changes. That's actually controlled centrally as well through a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. So across the board, when autonomic nervous system misbehaves, you end up with the symptoms that look like multiple system atrophy. Now, this is meant to be a busy slide and hard to follow because it really gets into the details that make it so difficult, as we've heard not only from Dr. Mayu's personal account this morning as both a family member and a caregiver and a physician on how difficult it is to even make that diagnosis. And Dr. Rao talked about historically going back for nearly 100 years how we still struggle to make the diagnosis. And so when you distill down the diagnostic criteria for MSA, we think of it in three major groups. We think of definite MSA. And as we've heard with our friend Robin Riddle from what's being done with brain banking, the only way today to make a definitive diagnosis of MSA is with proven pathology, including those glial cytoplasmic inclusions that my colleague Dr. Lee is going to talk about. And if you have probable MSA, well, then you recognize that you've got a sporadic progressive disease of autonomic failure, and you've got the urinary incontinence or erectile dysfunction, or some orthostatic blood pressure changes, so sort of in the either or for probable, plus Parkinsonism or cerebellar dysfunction. So Parkinsonism plus dysautonomia or cerebellar dysfunction plus dysautonomia makes a diagnosis of clinical probable. And we heard last night at dinner how important it was to be brave enough as physicians to make those diagnoses and have patients be aggressive with what they're going to do with interdisciplinary care and long-term planning and getting involved with organizations such as the MSA Coalition. Possible MSA is when we're still hedging. There's a little bit of Parkinsonism or a little bit of cerebellar dysfunction to go along with dysautonomia, and you're just not sure, we're just not sure. And of course, there's other supportive features like abnormalities that are seen on examination with increased reflexes and spasticity of gait and early falls and lack of an appropriate response to L-DOPA. All of these things go into our hope to be able to make an earlier, better diagnosis of either MSAP or MSAC. So I'm going to pass off now to Dr. Lee. She's going to walk us through a little bit of a historical perspective in the who, what, where. The laser is the red button. There we go, see it?
Can y'all see that little red dot up there? Okay. And then this one. Okay. Thank you very much for having me and for traveling here. I really have a heck of a lot of respect and am humbled by those who've traveled far, because I know it's not the easiest thing in the world to travel. So we think that this is a rare disease, less than 5 people per 100,000 in the population, but as Dr. Abisamba and I were just discussing, it feels like we know more people with this, and it's not just because we're in a movement disorders clinic, but possibly because there's more recognition. And I do get patients about once every couple months for a second opinion of their Parkinson's disease that I have to tell is probably MSA. And if they had stayed with their first physician, they would have gone through life and death thinking that they had Parkinson's. So this number, 4 to 5 people per 100,000, may actually be an underestimate. It is more common with aging, and there's a slight tendency toward the Parkinsonian type than the cerebellar type, except in Japan where there's the opposite. Usually affects people in their 50s and 60s, which is a little younger than Parkinson's, which is typically 60s, 70s, 80s. And men and women are both equally affected. The progression, as you heard with Hal, is about 5 to 15 years. The why of MSA. So no clear cause has been found, but as Dr. Rao alluded to earlier, a lot has been discovered in the last 20 years, and even in the last 4 years in particular. We think that it's largely sporadic, meaning just happens for no good reason, but there could be some genetic influence in some families. There are no obvious environmental risk factors, and there are more MSA patients that are non-smokers and non-drinkers than the opposite. And this also occurs in Parkinson's. We don't recommend that you go out and start drinking and smoking. We think it's more a personality trait that the person who's just not really all that interested in those things might have some tendency toward those diseases. The what and how of MSA. So I was afraid this slide might be a little light, and I apologize, but hopefully I can walk you through this. So as Dr. Rao mentioned, it's these little helper or support cells that get affected most in MSA. So what you're looking at here is a diagram of a nerve cell and its body or head, and then its tail or its axon. And these little helper cells called glial cells or oligodendrocytes are helping support that axon. In Parkinson's disease, we'll get accumulation of the alpha-synuclein protein in the head of the axon itself, the nerve cell itself. But in MSA, we see them not only in the nerve cells sometimes, but also in these helper cells. And helper cells outnumber nerve cells by, I think, 15 or 20 to 1 maybe. And so as they die off or get sick from the alpha-synuclein, they can't support that nerve cell, and then the nerve cell dies too. So this picture down here is the helper cell getting too sick and dying off, and then the nerve cell, which I think it's gone now too, at that picture. And as Dr. Rao also mentioned, there might be some progression through the brain of the alpha-synuclein proteins. And these are, I can't even read those things down there now. But as the protein spreads, it might affect different parts of the brain. All right, so then how MSA progresses in a more pragmatic approach and less academic approach. So we talk about pre-motor MSA, meaning before you or your doctor could notice anything on the outside, as year 0 and before. And that's when Dr. Houghton just mentioned sexual dysfunction might occur, urinary dysfunction, might have something called REM sleep behavioral disorder where you act out your dreams, and maybe a little orthostatic hypotension in the beginning. And just as a case with Hal, your doctor might assume, wow, this means maybe you're under a lot of stress, or you've got now a new anxiety about something. In other words, these don't tell us a whole heck of a lot and can occur in a lot of other situations. As time passes, though, you might get the stridor with the tight vocal cords, a little bit of Parkinsonism or cerebellar features, and this is where if you see a doctor at this point, usually they'll say, oh, I know what you've got. You've got Parkinson's disease, or you've got some kind of ataxia. You need to see a neurologist. And then during this probable MSA, we're getting some more pyramidal signs. Means some of the reflexes are acting differently than what we'd expect for normal. You're getting more autonomic failures, so that sexual dysfunction, urinary dysfunction, and orthostatic hypotension are becoming much more obvious. And then late stages, as we get into late stages, recurrent falls. Actually, this little box could move all the way over here, I think. Needing indweller catheter, problems with making decisions and having able to multitask, unintelligible speech, and needing a gastrotomy or a hole to feed yourself, tracheostomy for breathing, fevers, and then death. And as both David and Dr. Rao alluded to, right in here during possible MSA, I'll tell you that all but a few of us physicians will keep hoping that it's Parkinson's disease. So if you see us again, we say, okay, let's try levodopa again. I want to see the effect. Let's do this, let's do that, until it can be proven to ourselves, too, that this is what that is. So confirming the diagnosis. Should we look into further clinical testing? So the imaging can be supportive, and Dr. Rao gave you some short pictures of some MRIs. Like Mickey Mouse brain is one thing we might look for PSP. MSA can be helpful. There's a little sign called a hot crust bun sign in the pontine area of the brain. But they're not diagnostic. If you don't have that hot crust bun sign, it doesn't mean that you don't have a MSA. And it's not a definitive way to find out what you have. Blood tests are wholly unhelpful except for ruling out other issues. So, and further tests, cardiac studies obviously can be very helpful, pulmonary, GI, urologic, and even sweat testing. And I'll add one more, and that's nerve conduction studies. So anybody heard of Johnny Cash? Johnny Cash was thought maybe he had MSA, but turned out he had a severe peripheral neuropathy, which was found by nerve conduction studies. So when we do these tests, we're looking for other diagnoses, not confirming MSA. Hallmarks of the early therapy. So when we're trying to treat the motor symptoms, and by motor symptoms we mean the stiffness or slowness or tremor, we do try levodopa. Levodopa is the main ingredient in Sinemet or Stalevo. It's always paired with carbidopa. It's a little chaperone medication to get it to the stomach. We have tried dopamine agonists as well, like Mirapex or Requip or Nupro, but those drugs have a high tendency of worsening orthostatic hypotension. So in my experience, it's been a little bit of a risk to take in even trying them. Amantadine is an unusual drug, initially invented for as an antiviral, but can help some stiffness, tremor, walking, and wakes the person up a little bit. It's a little bit stimulating, so it can help in that sense. And the benzodiazepines, another group of drugs that can really drop the blood pressure, so used sparingly in MSA, but they're very helpful at night for sleep and for reducing the active dreaming. And then probably most important in the early therapy is a multidisciplinary rehab program, meaning physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, and then of course the cardiac rehab where it's needed as well. As far as the GI symptoms, not getting the bowels to move, or the bowels not moving well enough, we use some diet modifications and then some propulsants, in other words, laxatives. Urologic symptoms with the retention that you heard about, not being able to void a bladder completely, there are different steps for that, like timed urinations, exercises. There are medications, and we'll typically rely on a urologist to make those recommendations. Self-catheterization, suprapubic catheterization, which just means the tube's coming out above your genital area, and botulinum toxin for the bladder to reduce spasticity, as well as bladder stimulators. For the lung and ENT symptoms, there's also botulinum toxin for the vocal cords, as well as for excessive drooling. So the vocal cord injections would have to be done by an ear, nose, and throat doctor that specializes in it. We do the botulinum toxins in our clinic for excessive drooling. That's what sialorrhea means, and just injected into the cheek. CPAP or BiPAP, those are the breathing machines used at night typically. And then for severe cases with pulmonary and stridor, having difficulty breathing, they get tracheostomies. Sleep symptoms, namely the restless sleep or active dreaming, fighting in your sleep. Sleep hygiene refers to going to bed on time, at the same time, waking up at the same time, using the bed only for sleep. Melatonin is an over-the-counter supplement used to help to reduce the active dreaming. And like I said before, the benzodiazepines are very helpful for reducing RBD, or REM behavioral sleep disorder. For the cognitive symptoms, the trouble multitasking, some maybe short-term memory problems, non-pharmacologic refers to like the online test and exercises that you could do, exercise in itself. Medications include the memory medicines. Nearly all memory medicines on the market have an indication for Alzheimer's disease, but we do use them also in other areas for cognitive problems that are occurring, and that often confuses patients when they get their little printout from the pharmacy and say, oh my God, she thinks I have Alzheimer's too. It's just we're using them as well for the memory. Mood symptoms, including, so mood meaning obviously depression, anxiety. We can use the psychotherapy, counseling, again, medications. Avoiding the TCAs mainly because of that active dreaming and other dry mouth and side effects from those. All right, so now I hand it over to Dr. Abisambra.
I guess it's still good morning. I'm, a stranger in this, apparently should be a stranger in this community, but I'm a cardiologist who, for one reason or another, had an interest in autonomics, and I've been doing this for a long time, since my fellowship. Unlike Dr. Rao, I don't admit to my age, I just say I'm legal, but, So we're going to, I'm sorry. Which one is that? The punto, just the punto. The red one. Okay. All right. So the autonomic dysfunction is very common in MSA. And I have the pleasure of actually being the go-to guy for treatment of hypotensive episodes, meaning low blood pressure episodes. They're generally manifested as lightheadedness, dizziness, blood pressure fluctuations noted at home or by providers. And often, by providers, sometimes, they start, pushing alarm buttons that, confuse patients a lot and, make them worry tremendously. We'll get to that a little bit later. If this gets to be very severe, then you get what we call passing out or syncope. The word of syncope, is basically from the Greek. It means that you passed out and then you woke up. You didn't just, stay down. When you have syncope, and that's a big important thing to mention, you can have syncope for many, many, many reasons. In general, if we think you have MSA, we're going to kind of tend to blame it to autonomic dysfunction. But if we're early in the disease, or even if we're a little later in the disease, one can pass out from multiple other issues. Everybody can have other diseases. So it's very important to rule out the syncope that is of cardiovascular origin that can be easily fixed. And we'll get to that a little bit. There are some palpitations that occur with it, meaning your heartbeat can go fast or slow, and it can be disturbing. But it also can tell you that maybe if my heart is, every time before I pass out, my heart is going really fast, it's probably not autonomic dysfunction only. It's probably a rhythm disturbance that's actually potentially very dangerous. So what are the symptoms associated with syncope or fainting? So we like to separate them into three different stages, what comes before, what comes during, and what comes after. So before, you may have some lightheadedness, some gradual loss of vision and or motor tone. During the episode, if sometimes there is a seizure, and people, a lot of times people pass out and everybody comes and tells us, oh, they've had a seizure, and they go on seizure medications and so on. And sometimes this goes on for years and years until somebody realizes, well, really, the only reason they have seizures is because they fainted, the brain doesn't get blood flow, and it is allowed to seize for a few seconds. And so if it occurs, a seizure in syncope is manifested as a short-lasting tonic stiffening that follows the loss of motor tone. So it's very important to look at, if you're a partner or a friend, and you see your friend pass out and then, go down and seize. If you notice that initially they lost their tone, it's almost never a seizure. And then they stiffen up like this. It's almost never a seizure. It's actually just a manifestation of the passing out as a seizure. The true primary seizures, they'll stiffen up first. They will not get pale. They will start seizing and stiffening. And it lasts much longer. Instead of 30 seconds, it's about 2 minutes. Now, after the episode, if you have a quick recovery and you have no after effects, most people will say, hey, great, I feel great, doc. Forget about it, this was fine, it just bothered me for a second, what's up with that, why are you bothering me? That's the one that you actually want to look at, because usually these suggest a cardiovascular episode, like a rhythm disturbance that can kill you. However, in advanced autonomic dysfunction, it can present like that. People will faint, and then they will not have the autonomic after effects that occur with fainting. So now, if you have neurocardiogenic syncope, which is what you know frequently as the common syncope, the common faint, where people, when you go and give blood, and then people, kind of turn pale, that's almost always with symptoms of vascular collapse or vagal overstimulation that you have at the end. So, people do not feel bad afterwards. You probably need to look into it for something more serious. All right. Now, so we talked a little bit about the seizure. Is it syncope? We've decided that it is syncope. And if it is syncope, I'd like to divide them between the real McCoys and then the benign but pesky ones. So the real McCoys are the more serious than a heart attack. I'll show you some numbers that prove that. So actually, a syncope due to a rhythm disturbance that does not get treated has a worse prognosis than a heart attack in terms of survival after a year. And we can divide them into two groups: the cardiac obstructive lesions, meaning if you have a valve that's obstructive, You cannot push blood forward. Theoretically, you can drop. Most of the time when that happens, if you cannot push blood forward because of your aortic valve, for instance, is extremely tight, you do not wake up. It's over. So generally when you wake up, it's actually a rhythm disturbance along with the aortic stenosis that the aortic stenosis has caused. But the ones that, we will actually be dealing with the large majority of patients, the healthy ones, as well as people who have autonomic dysfunction, go under the pesky category. And these are all due to anomalies of peripheral blood pressure control. So just as I said, be careful about the ones that are sudden, because they're deceptive. They have lack of after effects. You think you're good, but you're not. Then, because they're deceptive, you lose the opportunity of actually taking care of them. Every single rhythm disturbance that causes syncope is treatable. We can do anything. Trust me. So this is just a graph plotting what happens to people when you actually find that this was a cardiovascular reason to pass out. At a year, you already have about 25% mortality, which is nowadays for a heart attack is about 10%. And then if you do not have a cardiovascular reason, it's almost like the same as the general population. All right. What are the faints that don't kill? The ones that are benign but they're pesky. Some of them are not so benign because they're so recurrent that, obviously they affect the lifestyle tremendously. These are, in fact, the most common ones. I'm sorry. And they occur both in the general population and in patients with MSA. These are the most common ones. They are also the most recurrent, the hardest to treat. They're very, they're not easy to treat. That's why David always sends them to me. He doesn't like to. They need to be positively identified so as not to miss other more serious causes, and they are best diagnosed by taking a careful history. When I was younger, I used to say, why do you consult a neurologist for a syncopal attack? There's no reason, it's not a neurologic disease. Actually, most cardiologists don't like to take histories. They send them to the neurologist to get a good history, and then they take them back. So they are due to abnormalities and or temporary failures of the blood pressure autonomic regulatory mechanisms. So if we want to do this a little bit simpler, why do we faint and why do we not faint? We faint because we stand up. We're the only animals who faint, and we have, who stand up, and we pay for it in two really major ways, back pain and fainting. We maintain our consciousness by delivering blood flow to our brains, and we're kind of somehow built like a high-rise. We have to get blood flow to the penthouse, which is the brain. And then, unfortunately, instead of putting the reservoirs on top of our head, they put them in our legs, in the basement. And so we need a pump that relays things upstream, unfortunately, and that's our heart that does that. Now, why is it that we do not faint? We should theoretically faint every single time if we didn't have any ways of, adjusting for positions. As David was saying, it's our autonomic nervous system. We have a host of very complicated blood pressure control mechanisms. We have positional and volume changes that, give the input data to our heart and then relays it from our heart to the brain. And then we have output response that, the brain now says, okay, I get this volume data, let me do something about it and transfer it through the vagus or the adrenergic system. So I guess, you've seen this a little bit. We have the vagal system. It's more active. I call it, our brakes. So it's kind of like a car. We're mostly in the parked position. 90% of the time, we're kind of, inactive. When we sleep, the vagal tone is up. When we are resting, the vagal tone is up, but not as much. And then when we want to actually get moving, the first thing that we do, like with a car, you remove the brakes. Then after you remove the brakes, a little while later, what do? You press the gas on. And the gas is your adrenergic system. So it's more active with activity. It's the yang to the vagus yin. When we stand up, the vagus is inhibited first. The adrenergic system is stimulated second. I'd like to say, to show you this, just to look at it for a second, and that's it. It's complicated. So these are the different abnormalities in blood pressure. The reflex syncope is the common one for people who are healthy. POTS is somewhere an intermediate disease. It's in healthy people, apparently healthy people, but it harasses them a lot. And then you have the Scheidegger, the pure autonomic failure, can be acute or chronic, primary or secondary. You have the multiple system atrophy, which, as we discussed already, can be Parkinsonian or cerebellar or mixed. And the abnormalities of blood pressure control are due to hypofunctioning of one or more portions of the baroreceptor reflex system. And there is, it's kind of similar with, it's a chronic, progressive, irreversible, unfortunately, and eventually debilitating, neurodystrophic disease. The one thing, though, that very infrequently do people present with complete autonomic dysfunction that you actually can tell every single time how they're going to react. You have those, but it's rare. I've seen maybe, I've been in this business long enough, I've seen a lot of people, and there are maybe 10, 15 that I've taken care of where every time they stand up, they want to pass out. Every time they lie down, their blood pressure is up to wazoo. In general, it's somewhere in between. The disease is, more or less, some things are still functioning. And actually what's even more, disturbing is that it's functioning today, it's not functioning the next day, and then it functions back on and then back and forth. So it makes treatment a little bit difficult when you have severe hypertension lying down and severe hypotension standing up. And if you have inexperienced, healthcare workers next to you, they're going to really be very concerned about your hypertension. They're going to treat your hypertension, and then you're going to be very hypotensive. In my book, if you have autonomic dysfunction, the first order of things is to prevent the low blood pressures. Hypertension, we can treat, we can deal with. I have a nice, vignette, actually. We had this one patient with Scheidegger's disease who required, colectomy, went to surgery, and he was lying down. And then the anesthesiologist was just going nuts with blood pressures of 300, pushing things like they're crazy. Just pushing things, and then 300 goes down to 290, pushes some more stuff, toxic doses. So he gave us a consult. So come on, what do you, I was doing hypertension at the time. So I went there, and just unfortunately, all I had to say is sit him up. And then we set him up, and blood pressure was 120, and he almost killed me. So there are these things that you have to be, to think about, and that's a trick that I tell all of my patients who have severe autonomic dysfunction, that, when you lie down, you really don't lie down, you kind of lie on an angle, you raise the head of the bed for about 6 inches, and that helps you in a couple of ways. First, your blood pressure doesn't go up as much. Second, that helps you actually decrease your urinary clearance of body fluids overnight. So your GFR decreases, and then you're not as dehydrated in the morning. So when you get up in the morning, you don't tend to pass out as much. Your blood pressure is not as low because you're not as dehydrated. And let me see if I think David is telling me that, I should shoo away.
I'm getting yelled at from the back of the room. They keep peeking in.
Yeah. So one last thing. So, how do we do this? I use a tilt testing, to get the diagnosis, and that's very important. A lot of times when things are, kind of borderline, this test helps a lot. I call it my torture lab, but it does help a lot. If we do good tilt testing, we can actually direct the treatment specifically to what ails you in the autonomic nervous system, whether it's blood volumes or different things like that. And this is a typical autonomic dysfunction response. Blood pressure gradually always drops. The diastolic blood pressure never goes up; it always drops. And the heart rate actually, doesn't increase. Now, if you have the normal response for the flight and fright reaction, everything is normal until you get the reflex that gets stimulated by, the so-called flight and fright reflex. I'm not going to go into the details, but you can see that suddenly everything was normal, and then boom, you drop, as opposed to that. And maybe let's just show you a slide for things. Really, the mainstay of treatment for autonomic dysfunction is midodrine. And that's a drug that, squeezes your blood vessels, and seems to be quite good at preserving blood flow to various organs as opposed to most alpha stimulants. And you can, there's not a lot of literature about, what happens after 10 years of use, but I've used it for 10, 15 years on the same people, and we do not see, apparently, really any major significant downside of it. And you can actually, the dosage is supposed to be 5 milligrams 3 times a day. You're supposed to take the first dose in the morning before you get up, 30 minutes, while you're in bed. Then 5 hours later, you take your second dose. 5 hours later, you take your third dose. And then you stop because you have to go to sleep and you don't need your hypertension during sleep. That's how it starts. But then, basically, it's up on you to understand how it works and adjust the dosage up and down constantly. I have a patient who is could not sit up, came to us, complete failure, and who, was in the hospital for weeks before getting transferred to us. They couldn't sit her up. Every time she raises her head, she passes out. So she's now taking, instead of the standard 2.5 to 5 milligrams 3 times a day, she's taking 10 milligrams every hour and a half. Completely functional. So she has pure autonomic failure, and she also has some bladder issues, so I'm not sure where she's going to go. But she went back to work, everything. So there's a lot of adjustments that can be done. And I'm going to just, the take-home message basically is not all loss of consciousness is syncope. Most syncope is rather benign and due to vasodepressor reactions. Syncope that doesn't tell you it's coming, especially when associated with quick recovery, may be quite serious and should be actually looked at. With a thoughtful approach, all causes of syncope can be appropriately managed. And I'm going to plug this for everybody because, I guess I took that from my wife. She used to volunteer for the brain injury group here. And always cherchez la femme. That's for people in Louisiana, that could be a good resource book. And David?
That's great. Well, thank you.
I usually close the deal, but...
Close the deal. We're going to get some knowing glances from outside the room. So thanks to all of you for coming for our early. I invite you to go next door now where they'll talk to you about the MSA registry. Please, if you have questions, write them down on sheets of paper. Those will be collected. We have a medical panel that will be meeting right after lunch where a lot of the questions that you've learned this or that you may have picked up from this morning will be answered, and we'll take more questions then. Thanks to all of you, and we'll get the doors open now. Sorry, I'm like, they keep opening the door and I'm here no time. All right, let's start up the next one. Wait, turn around. I'm different or you're slow?
Oh, same.
Same. Okay,
Yeah, there's, just...
We'll touch straight up. Let's do a lot more on the treatment. Because hers are heavy on treatment.
Okay.
And we'll do, yours will be heavier on treatment. Yes, sir. Ask her if she's slow. I think we'll spend a couple of minutes with folks getting settled, and we'll get started again. Yes, ma'am. Yes. So what you'll see here is a lot of what we just did, but we're truncating the beginning part and expanding the end of the part. Recognize that there'll be some people who went in and wanted to keep both, some people who wanted one and not the other. But we'll take some advantage of the nickel. We figured with the living, with the early glad you're here. I was hoping you would give this talk.
I missed you first. I got
That's okay. Jump on in. All right. So thanks to all of you that are here for our Living with Advanced MSA talk. There's a lot of similarities between this one and the first one, purposefully, because we want to make sure that everybody gets an idea on how multiple system atrophy presents, how it's diagnosed, and how it's treated. But while the first one, we spent significant amount of time getting into the diagnosis, talking about the pathology, and then sort of went quickly over a lot of the treatments at the end. This one's going to dig deeper into the treatments. And for those of you who don't recall who I am, I'm Dr. Houghton. I'm the host physician. Thanks to all of you for coming here, and I hope the ones that are in the room now really enjoyed their time with the registry next door. It's a fascinating new addition to what we're doing with MSA to allow us to really follow so many people with the disease and have folks available for clinical trials. I'm honored today to be with two of my closest colleagues here at Ochsner Health System. Dr. Georgia Lee is on my left. She's going to be tackling much of what we do with the how, what, and why of MSA, and most importantly, digging deeper into some of the treatment options that will affect patients as they progress. And then we've carved out a special place for my friend in cardiology, Dr. Freddie Abisamra, who's an expert in the electrophysiology of the heart, and particularly as that relates to autonomic failure. And I'll allow both of them to introduce themselves as well when they come up. So our last one went over a little bit because it's such a deep topic to get into, so we'll try to do our best staying on time because it's only us between you and lunch at this point. I'll also encourage you, if you have questions, to write them down so that after this presentation, at a little after 12:30, we'll go to lunch, and then you'll come back and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and or if you're less comfortable asking them in person, we'll read them from the cards so that we can make sure that everybody's questions get answered. So without further ado, it's always good to level set again about what we've been talking about here, which is multiple system atrophy. This is a progressive disorder that affects multiple systems within the body, but they're all under one same general control. You know, the brain is like the computer system. It's the main CPU that helps run all parts of the autonomic functions of our body. And autonomic function is what we also would call the automatic nervous system. So the reality is that disorders of or our ordinary utilization of our cardiovascular health, like heart rate and blood pressure, and our respiratory health, like the drive to breathe, and what our ENT docs do with the vocal cords in the upper part of the face, and when it goes wrong, you can develop stridor with your breathing. Or what happens with our urological function, with the control of our urinary stream, both the starting and stopping of that, as well as sexual health affecting a younger individual. We realize that multiple system atrophy is under the direct control of that autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is really paired into two major parts, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system is the classic fight or flight. This is evolutionarily the reason that if we were looking outside of our cave and we saw a saber-toothed tiger go by, in order for our genetic code to be passed on for eons, we need to make a decision. Are we going to fight that tiger or are we going to run? And under both circumstances, the sympathetic nervous system is what allows our pupils to get big so we can see it better. And it makes our mouth dry when we're nervous. And it locks up our bladder because no one wants to stop and urinate while they're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. Similar to that, but opposite, is the parasympathetic nervous system, like two halves of a seesaw. The parasympathetic nervous system is also called the rest and digest portion. So that allows your pupils to constrict, and it lowers your heart rate, and it lowers your blood pressure, and it concentrates on things like digestion and control of urination. So really we live in a balance between our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, and it's at times when that balance becomes out of whack. And so what happens when our multiple systems and multiple system atrophy misbehave? That's where we have stridor of our voice, and where we'll have our blood pressure go down and stay down when we stand up without an appropriate reaction of our heart rate, or where we lose control of our bladder, or we develop sexual dysfunction at an early age, or we have significant constipation and early satiety, meaning every meal that we eat feels like it just stays in our stomach and isn't moving through. It's in the history taking with our physicians that we pick up those symptoms with our patients, and then we start to think about those disorders of the neurological system and how it affects the body, in whether that could be multiple system atrophy. So I'm going to pass off now to Dr. Lee. She's going to talk a bit more about the what and how of multiple system atrophy.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for inviting me. So we're going to talk about the what and how of MSA. Dr. Rao spoke briefly, or maybe in depth, about some of the research over the past 20 and 50 years. I'm going to talk some more about that alpha-synuclein protein. So I'm going to show you this slide over here, and I'm sorry it's a little bit washed out, but you hear a lot about the alpha-synuclein protein getting clumped up and killing off cells. So on your right, this that the arrow is pointing at right now is an axon, or a nerve cell, and its tail, or the axon, is down here. And this cell right here is a helper cell, or a support cell, otherwise known as glial or oligodendrocyte. And it's supporting this nerve cell. So in Parkinson's disease, they get alpha-synuclein clumps more in the nerve cells. In MSA, they get a little bit heavier hit in the support cells, or the glial cells. And the glial cells outnumber nerve cells by, I think, 10 to 15 to 1. So as these get injured and they fall off of the axon or the nerve, then the nerve cell will also die too. Dr. Houghton, and then I think even Dr. Mayo mentioned about alpha-synuclein being a possible prion. And what that might mean is that when the cell dies and those little proteins get out, they not only infect the next cell, but actually replicate and make more proteins. We think that Parkinson's patients don't have that same infectious prion type, and it might be a different strain of the alpha-synuclein. So how does MSA actually progress? Down on the bottom row is the number of years. 0 is the mark where we think you're diagnosed maybe, or your first physical symptoms appear. Pre-motor MSA is all your symptoms prior to that date that might have actually been related to MSA. So in that list is sexual dysfunction, urinary dysfunction, REM, sleep behavioral disorder, or RBD, is an active dreaming disorder, and orthostatic hypotension. So if you presented to your primary care doctor with any one of these things, certainly MSA would be very far from their mind, because these could happen in many other problems. But as what happened to Hal is the doctor also assumed maybe he was having an anxiety or depression, which a lot of these things could also happen in that. This is followed by some stridor, Parkinsonism, or cerebellar features. And it's at this point where we physically can look at you on the outside and know that something is definitely wrong, and where your primary care at that point would say, oh, I think I know what this is. You probably have Parkinson's disease, or ataxia. You should go see a neurologist. Following this, you might get some multi-domain autonomic failure, meaning some more of these first things, just worse, and some problems with your reflexes. And then probable MSA extends a whole lot of time here, because during this period, even specialists like Dr. Houghton, Rao, and I have some questions. Is this really MSA? Are we missing something else? Is it Parkinson's? Are you just not taking your medicines right? But you're having recurring falls. At some point, some people need indwelling catheters, some problems with multitasking, even PEG tubes, or tubes that help you feed, breathe, and then fevers and sudden death. And I'll be honest with you, I think right here in these first few years, we are also in denial as your physician. And we might think it in the back of our head, but we keep thinking, well, let's check one more thing, or let's look one more time. And that's where Dr. Rao's slide about, you're the expert, why don't you know what I have, kind of hit home. It's like, well, I have a suspicion, but I don't want to scare you yet, and I'm not quite sure. Hallmarks of advanced therapy for MSA. So treating the motor symptoms, meaning the stiffness or rigidity or tremor. We will typically use levodopa. Levodopa is the active ingredient in Sinemet or Stalevo. Always goes with carbidopa, its chaperone pill. And this is the gold standard for treatment in Parkinson's disease. And this medicine can help reduce the tremors, can help reduce the stiffness, and going back to our inability to diagnose you in the first few years, there can be a decent response to that medicine. So, we pat ourselves on the back saying, yay, he responds to levodopa, he's probably got Parkinson's, and then a few years later it's not working as well. Can also use some anti-nausea medications to get levodopa in, as it can cause nausea. Dopamine agonists are also used to treat Parkinson's and RLS, restless leg syndrome. I typically shy away from them in MSA because one of their main side effects is drops in blood pressure. Amantadine is another one used for rigidity and tremor, and has a handy side effect of stimulating you or making you more awake. Botulinum toxin, I'll talk about in the next slide, has a couple of modalities of use. You might know it as Botox or Xeomin. And then benzodiazepines are very handy for treating sleep disorders and especially the active dreaming. But as they can also drop blood pressure, we don't often use them during the day. Other surgical options have been discussed. DBS, or deep brain stimulation surgery, as you might know, is used in Parkinson's disease. In MSA, it does not yet have a role. Duopa is a pump used to infuse levodopa, used now in Parkinson's disease, but does not yet have a role in MSA, and probably, I imagine, won't have a role since the effectiveness of levodopa wanes after the first few years. And then multidisciplinary rehab programs such as physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy are all extraordinarily important and very helpful. For the GI symptoms, and mainly we're talking about constipation in particular, increasing fluids and fiber intake. We can use Metamucil, Citracel, Colace, milk of magnesia. Basically, what I tell people is we want to bulk it up, we want to speed it up, and we want to soften it up. So there are bulkers, which is the fibers. To speed it up, you actually need something like milk of magnesia, and to soften it up, you need something like Colace. There are also some non-dopaminergic propulsants. These are the ones that will speed it up, get the bowels to actually move. And those listed, Amicia, Linzess, we've had some success in our clinic with. Lactulose, Glycolax, those are also laxatives. So in the urologic symptoms, meaning urination and having to avoid timed urinations can be helpful. Exercises for the sphincter of the bladder can be helpful. At some point, though, many have to go to self-catheterization, and then even some have to go through to permanent catheterization. Botulinum toxin can be used with urinary retention and inside the bladder to reduce the spasming. For lung and ENT symptoms, again, the botulinum toxin can be used to relax those vocal cords so they don't pinch together so bad. An ENT who's trained in that kind of procedure can do that. And botulinum toxin or anticholinergic medications are used for sialorrhea, which is excessive drooling. And we do a lot of the botulinum toxin injections. They go in the cheek to reduce the production of the saliva. BiPAP and CPAP are, of course, the breathing machines used for breathing problems during sleep. And unfortunately, some patients have to go to tracheostomy because their vocal cords are so tight that they can't get air through them. Sleep symptoms, and typically for sleep we're talking about problems with falling asleep and restless leg, as well as the REM sleep disorder, which I mentioned before, acting out dreams, talking. Sleep hygiene refers to just keeping a very strict regimen of falling asleep and waking up, and only sleeping in the bed, nothing else. Melatonin is an over-the-counter supplement used to help reduce the active dreaming. And again, benzodiazepines can be very helpful for reducing the active dreaming, helping somebody with insomnia, but they can drop blood pressure, so we don't often use them during the day. For cognitive symptoms, memory problems, and multitasking issues, the non-pharmacologics refers to like the online brain games and tests, keeping your brain exercised. Dr. Rao actually just admitted to me that he's still working so he doesn't get dementia. Medications, including some acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, glutamate antagonists. These are memory medications. You might recognize them by their other brand names like Aricept, or rivastigmine is Exelon, glutamate is Namenda. Mood symptoms, including depression and anxiety, can be treated with psychotherapy or counseling, as well as medications. The benzodiazepines can help reduce anxiety. Antidepressants can help all of those things. We avoid the TCAs, which is the tricyclic antidepressants, where possible, because they actually block that rest and relax system Dr. Houghton was just talking about, and you can get more constipation, more dry mouth, more problems urinating with them. So now we move on to the cardiology.
Thanks. So for those who were here before, excuse the repetition, but I'll try to spend more time on the treatment rather than the pathophysiology. Just to go back, what we're interested in is here orthostatic hypotension, meaning, when we stand up, we lose blood pressure with its attendant symptoms of lightheadedness when it's mild, dizziness, or passing out when it's severe. It's very important to be able to recognize that when we pass out, there could be other reasons to pass out than just autonomic dysfunction, even for people who are afflicted with MSA, because cardiovascular issues can happen. People in certain age groups have other issues, and that has to be ruled out, specifically because syncope due to cardiovascular causes is very well treatable, and it doesn't have to lead to a death or premature death. And syncope due to cardiovascular issues often leads to cardiovascular death, sudden cardiovascular death. So, the way to separate these is to kind of look at how the symptoms actually occur with syncope. There are 3 stages before the passing out spells. If you have some lightheadedness and the symptoms are gradual, it takes 2 or 3 minutes before something happens. In general, that's not cardiovascular. If during the episode itself, sometimes there's a seizure, it's important to actually make sure to understand that a seizure can occur as a result of passing out spell and does not mean that you have a convulsive disorder. And the seizure is very different from the primary convulsive disorder, whereby, with convulsive disorders, you stiffen up. With seizure due to syncope, you first get limp, and then you have a seizure. And the seizures are different. With syncope, it's short, 15 seconds, 30 maybe, and then it's stiffening only, with a little bit of shaking, as opposed to the grand mal that you see that would last 2 or 3 minutes. Afterwards, usually there's a little bit of confusion with syncope. Patient looks pale, but with a true seizure, there's really deep sleep, and there's no responsiveness for 15, 20 minutes, even though the patient is breathing and doing their thing. And usually, there's no pallor. Now the important thing for us, as cardiologists, is to separate people passing out from a blood pressure problem versus people passing out from a rhythm problem. If you wake up immediately and you feel perfectly fine and you think you're great, that's exactly the opposite of what you should be thinking. It's generally when you pass out and you come back right up, it's not your blood pressure playing tricks on you. It's usually a rhythm disturbance, and you have to actually get that seriously taken care of today rather than tomorrow, or looked into. Now, sometimes, unfortunately, with people with autonomic dysfunction, all of these things that tell you it's a blood pressure thing may get blunted, and it may actually present itself with people who have severe advanced autonomic dysfunction. It may present suddenly like a regular rhythm disturbance. It gets a bit confusing, but most of the time it's not. So, as I said, we're going to skip that here. Very important, again, I'm going to insist on this. The stuff that happens suddenly and finishes suddenly has to be ruled out, that there's no cardiovascular event, because we really can treat every single one of those. If your rhythm is fast, we can ablate it. If your rhythm is slow, we can place a pacemaker. If your rhythm is fast from the lower chamber, you may actually require either an ablation or a defibrillator. All of these things are actually commonly available nowadays. And just to show you, if you pass out from a blood pressure problem, your survival is very similar to what happens in the general community. If you pass out from a cardiovascular problem, either a rhythm disturbance or some serious cardiovascular problem, you will have about a 25% mortality rate at 1 year. This is worse than a heart attack. 15% for a heart attack, 25% for this. All right, so we're really interested in the faints that don't kill, but they really, kind of mess your life up because they actually keep recurring. In general, if you pass out 15, 20, 30 times in a month, you don't have a rhythm disturbance. It's very unusual. Usually it's a blood pressure thing. Otherwise, one of those rhythm disturbances would have, terminated into passing out and not waking up anymore. So, as I said, why do we faint? It's because we stand up. The brain is up, in the penthouse. The reservoirs for blood, when we stand up, blood pools, and then we have to push it up. And unfortunately, our reservoirs are not on top. Back home, all of our water reservoirs are on top, so we can get the water from the rain. This is different. The reason we don't faint is we have a really very complicated system that keeps us from fainting. And I'm not going to go over the vagal system and the sympathetic system because Dr. Houghton already went through this. But I'm going to show you, the different things that, how we actually mechanistically group the problems that happen when people pass out from a blood pressure issue. The most common ones are, the reflex syncope, which occur in the large majority of the normal population. Usually, something, typical when people are going to donate blood and they kind of turn pale and pass out. That's kind of what we have. There's another syndrome that's called POTS, and that's very common. You're going to see that a lot on, when you go online. There's a lot of things that have been, kind of bundled under POTS, and I hate, how, it's all have gone now. It's become a wastebasket diagnosis. But essentially the true POTS, if you have a true POTS, you really have an autonomic dysfunction that is incomplete, and it is the inability to vasoconstrict. But nowadays, anybody who passes out, people call me, oh, we have a POTS here. And now you don't. And then there is the Scheidegger, PAF, multiple system atrophy that, we're talking about. These are problems with vasoconstriction, problems with both limbs of the autonomic system. The vagus tends to actually, be the one that's affected first. So over time, you're going to see your heart rate pick up more. And then after a while, the heart rate goes back down because now the autonomic nervous system, the adrenergic nervous system, the adrenaline part is also affected. So there is a progression to this. The one thing that, is very important to understand when We're treating ourselves. We're not treating you. You're treating ourselves, and we're going to go over this a little bit. You need to understand that this fluctuates from day to day. So some days, people can have, there are very few patients that I've encountered who have complete autonomic dysfunction. Nothing happens no matter what they do. Other people, most of the patients have, symptoms one day, blood pressure fluctuates a lot more one day, and then another day it doesn't fluctuate at all. One day, they're hypotensive all day long. Other days, they're really, very hypertensive. So you have to be careful about that, and then you really have to educate yourself when you use the drugs. And we're going to go a little bit through this. I'm going to, just before we get to the treatment, what I do to diagnose people with autonomic dysfunction is take them to the autonomic lab. The mainstay of the tilt, is the tilt test. We put people in the lab, and then we actually tilt them for, this is an old slide, we made 20 minutes. Usually patients with autonomic dysfunction don't make it to the 20 minutes, but the standard tilt test is 30 minutes. We have certain criteria that tell us this is autonomic dysfunction, or no, this is neurocardiogenic syncope. We don't need to go through these, but this will give us a good diagnosis as whether or not there is autonomic dysfunction. The bottom line is that if your diastolic blood pressure, that's the low number, does not go up when you get tilted, that's bad. That's autonomic dysfunction. It means there's something in the system that did not relay all the way to the end and asked your blood vessels to vasoconstrict. And this is a typical tilt for an autonomic dysfunction patients. Blood pressure is often very high when they're lying down. This is the systolic blood pressure. This is the diastolic blood pressure, and the yellow is the heart rates. You don't see much change in heart rate, but you see a progressive drop in systolic blood pressure, and you see that the diastolic blood pressure never went up above the baseline. That's autonomic dysfunction. Normally, if you're dropping your blood pressure because you're anemic, you're hypotensive, you're bleeding, your heart rate should go way up. And you see here, it doesn't happen. So you're not communicating the reflex needs through the brain. All right. So how do we treat this? The first thing that we do, when I see somebody who doesn't have very severe problems, and even when people who have severe problems, but this is the first step, is we do actually delineate the weak link in the lab, obviously, and then we do a serious holistic program. We avoidance measures, proper hydration, caffeine intake, perhaps it's a double-edged sword. Caffeine increases the blood pressure for about an hour or two, but then you start diuresing more, so you lose water. Some people don't diurese, then, because you've taken the volume, that compensates some, so it depends on who you are, and you have to find out on your own. It's best to take small, frequent meals, but that doesn't mean that you decrease your caloric intake. You have to have a high caloric intake with high protein intake to keep your muscles in good shape, because guess what? Your veins have muscles, and your veins will actually start deteriorating in their ability to squeeze the blood back up to the heart and then to the brain. There's this, when you stand up, you should slowly, gradually change your position. Be careful. We tell you, most physicians will tell you, move your legs for about 15 seconds. That's the worst thing to do. Actually, what happens is you send some bolus of blood to your heart, and the heart thinks, hey, I'm fat and happy. And there are all these receptors within the heart that say, look, keep everything on the calm and steady. You have to move for about a minute or so that you actually have a good motion going. And not only from the legs, but also from the arms, because that comes from above, that's easy. When you're standing, that's going to come up more. So it's a full minute, it's not 15 seconds. If you do it for 15 seconds, you'll pass out more often. The other thing is I have kind of pseudo-contracted with a specific trainer who will send people to do lower body exercises, and she will give a prescription at the end of the session, which exercises work exactly for you. I used to do this myself and tell people, do this, do this, do that. Didn't really work well. And the reason is, I'm not good at this. I give a standard thing, and everybody's muscles are different. Everybody's strengths are different from the one muscle or another. And what happens is, if you train the wrong muscle, you may actually burn it up, and then you get lactic acidosis that drops your blood pressure whenever you do these exercises. So, unfortunately, you have to get somebody who's smart. They'll do the exercises, they'll check your blood pressures, they see what happens with each exercise, and then they go. If you want something simple, a recumbent bike is very helpful. Aerobic exercise is very helpful because, again, strong muscles, will increase venous return. Sleep habits. There's nothing that destroys you more than, if you don't sleep well, for your autonomics. The other thing that's important, we say elevate the head of the bed. That doesn't mean that you actually sit up or put 3 pillows behind you. You elevate the whole bed. You get 6-inch blocks, you elevate the bed, or you get one of those beds that actually, nowadays they're all available that, tilts up about 15 degrees. That gives you 2 advantages. One, if you're hypertensive when you lie down, you don't get to be hypertensive when you lie down. The second thing is, when you're tilted, when we're standing, we pee less than we're actually lying down. So you are less dehydrated if you're actually tilted up. In the morning when you get up, you're not as dehydrated. You don't tend to faint as much. That's why people faint the most in the morning, because the muscles are relaxed. So, when you're tilted, your muscles, tense up a little bit. You also are more dehydrated in the morning if you're not tilted. And then, I do this usually for about 4 months, and try to get along without any drugs. But then if it's very severe, we start with the drugs from the beginning and, with this. If it's mild, only after, 4 months of trying this really hard and, things are not good enough, then I do the drugs. Now, it's very important, you really need to be patient and perseverant, and not just me, you too. You more than me. You're going to be with yourselves a lot more than I'm going to be with you. So you have to understand how this works, and you have to adjust your treatment all the time on your own from day to day. So the mainstay of treatment in my book is midodrine. It's becoming a cheap drug. It's not as expensive as it used to be. It was an orphan drug that was specifically designed for orthostatic hypotension. And the standard treatment is 5 milligrams in the morning, and then 5 hours later, because it's a drug that has a short life, you take another dose, and then 5 hours later, you take another dose. And supposedly, you should not take your last dose more, closer than 4 or 5 hours before you go to bed. There are 2 reasons for that. Number 1 is when you lie down, you really don't care about fainting. Number 2, when you lie down, you tend to be hypertensive if you have autonomic dysfunction, so this will make you more hypertensive. Number 3, you need a holiday for this drug to keep working. There is something that, calls, you get, there's attenuation of effect if you don't give it an overnight holiday. Now, you have to actually adjust this. So what I tell my patients is, when you start on the treatment, take your blood pressure every hour first. The drug is supposed to last 5 hours, but guess what? Most of the time, it's variable. Everybody is different. Some people, it's really 5 hours. Other people, by the 3rd or 4th hour, the blood pressure starts dropping. I tell you then, if that's a pattern, take another dose then. If you take 5 milligrams and you measure your blood pressure an hour later, and your blood pressure now suddenly is 250 while you're seated or standing, well, that's a big dose for you. So decrease the dose, increase the frequency. You can decrease the dose, increase the dose, decrease the frequency, increase the frequency, depending on your blood pressure. And you may have to do this day in, day out, because things change, unfortunately. What are the side effects? Long-term side effects of very large doses. I do not see anything in the literature that has actually, benighted this drug. But, I've used it for many years. I haven't seen really anything that would be accumulation of drug in your system, like you don't grow an ear out of your, ear, of your mouth or something like that. Nothing, that seems to be weird. I have a patient who takes about 200 milligrams a day, completely, not functional before. Now she's going to work, she's working, she's driving, she does a lot of adjustments. She understands her disease. If you don't understand your disease, it does not work. Other things what are the side effects? 15% of people will have a very weird scratching of the head. I don't know why it happens, but it does happen. And then the other thing that it can actually worsen is your ability to urinate. It may make that a little bit more difficult. If there is some Alzheimer's. I found that in a couple patients, it seemed that the combination of Alzheimer's and midodrine made them more confused. What about droxidopa? Kind of similar to this. Doesn't have as much experience. It's more expensive. Recently released, supposedly, by technical criteria, supposedly for only 2 weeks use at a time. I don't know where this is going to go eventually. I don't use it as often. Now, Florinef is fludrocortisone. This is a drug that actually retains sodium in the body. The problem with it is that every time you retain sodium, you pour potassium out. So you replace sodium for potassium. It doesn't work very well. If you give it on its own, it doesn't really work very well. You have to give a lot of sodium to increase volume back at the level of the kidney. So you have to go and get your dietitian to give you a 4-gram sodium diet. On top of it, an additional 80 milliequivalents of potassium during the day. Otherwise, you can have very severe low potassium that can actually cause rhythm disturbances that can be fatal. The side effect of that is that you get swollen. If you get swollen, your legs get swollen, no problem. If you get swollen, you can't breathe, it's a problem. That causes heart failure. You can't take that drug anymore, or you have to decrease the dose. All right. The other stuff is not as good, but I'm going to skip these drugs. But the stockings can be helpful. So we sometimes, after we do a first tilt and we find, really very positive responses, we wrap the legs up with ACE wraps, and then, while massaging the legs, and then retilt, and a lot of people actually improve tremendously their tolerance to orthostasis. If you're doing this at home, you can actually get the measured stockings. They're very expensive. They have, the problem is, if they're not well measured, and you have more pressure on your ankles than on your knees, you're going to actually trap blood, which is the opposite of what you want to do. But unfortunately, these things cost $400 or something, and then you get about 100 use out of them. You have to buy 4 or 5 at the same time and rotate them to be able to actually get the 100 uses out of them. The alternative is to go to Walmart and get the true marked, off the shelf. They cost about $15, and then see whether you're better or not with it. If you put them on, the best way to put them on and to be helpful, you have to be lying on your back, raise your head, raise your legs, or somebody might help you, I'm sorry, and then massage the blood back towards your belly, and then put the socks on. If they're easy to put on, no good. All right, the other thing is, that's another important thing with the treatment of autonomic dysfunction, is you need to avoid supine and sleep hypertension. So as we said, elevate the head of the bed. And sometimes that's not good enough. You're not going to sleep like this, so you start sliding and everything. You may actually want your physician to give you a small dose of an antihypertensive that doesn't last long, very short acting, something that lasts about 3-4 hours, doesn't stay in the system long. The other thing that I do, because you do this long enough, you find that people who faint routinely on you, the blood pressure always goes back down. Then they have these periods where 2-3 weeks, they're hypertensive all the time. And then if you're hypertensive all the time, you cannot just simply stand up and drop your blood pressure, as you need. So what do we need to do? I try to avoid the hypertensive crises, the things that can cause problems. And those would be a small dose of a beta blocker. That usually avoids, like adrenaline to give what we call hypersensitive, the denervation hypersensitivity reactions. Sometimes, you start spilling adrenaline, and because your nerves are not used to seeing adrenaline, now when they see it, they just go into overdrive. And then you get a lot of vasoconstriction. So, take-home message, not all loss of consciousness is syncope. Most syncope is rather benign and due to vasodepressor reactions. That's generally for people who are not diagnosed with MSA. Unheralded syncope, meaning syncope without warning, especially when associated with quick recovery, may be quite serious. You should check with a cardiologist or electrophysiologist. Sometimes when we're confused, because with MSA, sometimes people pass out and give us the same picture as with rhythm disturbances. We can actually stick a loop under the skin It's a simple injection, essentially, and then that will monitor the heartbeat. So if there is another reason to pass out besides the blood pressure, we'll be able to find that and treat it accordingly. And then with a thoughtful approach, all causes of syncope can be appropriately managed. But I really want to, impress on you that we cannot treat this alone as physicians. You have to be your own treatment. You and your loved ones have to be in consortium, trying to constantly manage your blood pressures. For people who, I think it's for you now, David.
Thanks for the handoff. Thank
Sure.
you very much. So for the last 1 minute before lunch, but I thought it was important as we talked about and finished up our discussion of the advanced treatment of MSA, that I would be reminded, and we should all be reminded of some of the great work that was presented yesterday with regards to the use of palliative care and hospice and being interested in not only late-stage research but also brain donation. So this is one of the things I really enjoy talking about, is watching for trigger points with the management of not only the dysautonomia that we see, but other degrees of disability that may arise as the MSA goes forward. This idea of trigger points is really where you're going to best use your combinations with palliative management. So that being part of a palliative care program is going to allow you to have your specialists there for you, whether that be with a home care program or just through an outpatient protocol, to be able to jump in and help when you reach those trigger points. A trigger point might be like we heard about this morning with Hal, when suddenly the urinary tract infections weren't treatable anymore. Or a trigger point might be where you've reached a point where you've gone from a walker to a wheelchair and you're struggling with your blood pressure such that you have to tilt the chair upwards and backwards to try to maintain brain perfusion. These are big events, big points where you really want to have your interdisciplinary team, including palliative management, there for you. And be reminded, of course, that palliative care does not equal hospice. I think that was a really important point yesterday that was made by Dr. Malhotra and Robin Riddle, who's here with us here today. It is not the same thing. And early on, just to understand how you can continue to see your doctors, continue to treat things appropriately, but start that sensible scale back in concentrating on quality of life more than quantity is really an appropriate shift with the advanced care of MSA. And so I'd like to close here today with our reminder that MSA really is a journey. We've gotten to hear about it yesterday and today so far, and we're going to hear more about it this afternoon on where we're going with novel therapeutics and research and with clinical trials coming down the pike. Early management improves later outcomes. Be aggressive with your quality of life and recognize and prepare along the way. Thanks all very much. Let's go to lunch. Save your questions, leave them on the table. We'll round them up and we'll have them up here to discuss collectively after our meal.